Chapter 340. Meg inspected his own body, and it didn't appear to be much different from before. However, only he knew that after close to 70 days of sleepless practice in the test field for the god of cookery, he had already mastered all of the sword techniques and movement techniques in his memory. Furthermore, he had mastered all of them to the extreme in his current condition. Those sword techniques had been deeply engraved into his memory, and his body had already formed a conditioned reflexive memory. All he had to do was awaken those memories and attain true control over them. And now, he had achieved that. Meg clenched his fists, and repressed the urge to go upstairs and practice with his sword. If he were to encounter that third-tier magic beast bronze wild boar again, even if he couldn't defeat it in a direct confrontation, he was confident that he would be able to evade more gracefully and inflict more damage on it. He turned to look at the alarm clock beside his bed to find that it was exactly 5 a.m. Amy and Ugly Duckling were still asleep with sweet smiles on their faces, as if they were having a good dream. "Little brat, spicy grilled fish seems a little oily in the morning. Let's cook it at noon, and then we'll release the new dish at night." A smile also appeared on Meg's face at the sight of Amy's smile. He was looking forward to seeing how Amy would eat the fish. It would definitely be very interesting. After washing up, Meg made his way into the kitchen. There was a large oven in the corner of the stove, and it could cook 8 grilled fish at once. The tank with the prawns had been divided into 2 tanks, and there were 7 iridescent scale grass carps swimming happily in them. Looks like the system didn't set up some sort of ingredient hunting mission this time. Otherwise, I wouldn't even know where to find a grass carp that was raised in the sea. Meg even checked the spices, and only after making sure that all of the ingredients and cooking utensils were present did he heave a sigh of relief. The ranking mission will be completed in a couple of days. Amy should like Häagen-Dazs, right? Kids usually can't resist something as cold and sweet as this. Meg thought to himself as he kneaded the dough. As his braised chicken and rice increased in quantity, his ranking on the ranking list was also steadily rising. He had already reached 21st place the day before, and Ruggiamo had also re-entered the top 30 at 29th place. As such, Meg wasn't worried at all about this Aiden Square Food competition mission. Furthermore, the next rest day would be 1 day after the ranking mission, so it wouldn't affect his progress. "I bet that Amy's will make it into the top 20 this time. That goes without saying. Although this name is already quite good, I think Mammy Restaurant's 5 dishes should be in the top 5 of the rankings. Isn't the savory tofu pudding the most? After Mr. Mac refused to let us exchange 5 stars, it's been stuck at 66th and 67th place for a long time. It's all Mr. Mac's fault for not giving us enough tofu pudding every day." There were already many people waiting in front of the magic screen for the Aiden Square Food competition rankings to be released. Many of Amy's customers had gathered together to chat. During the past few days, it had become a habit for many of them to come here to see the rankings. "Hee, you won't be able to see him on the ranking list today. My roast meat is finally back at 29th place. A sinister smile appeared on Ricky's face as he looked at the 31st place Ricky's roast meat. He had received news this morning that Amy's was going to be removed from the ranking list, and everything was going to return to normal. At 7 a.m. sharp, the ranking list was updated. As the red words lit up, everyone's eyes also began to search the magic screen. After 8 days of competition, the rankings on the ranking list hadn't changed much, so most of the restaurant owners didn't have much anticipation on their faces. Ricky's roast meat, 29th place. Ricky yelled with excitement. Even though he had already anticipated this, he was still unable to repress the joy in his heart. "Our restaurant moved up 5 places. My restaurant also made it into the top 4. Could it be that business was good yesterday? Our restaurant made it into the top 100. That's great. The boss is definitely going to give us a bonus this month." Many of the restaurant owners' eyes also lit up. In particular, the restaurants that had been hovering around the top 100 had suddenly moved up 5 places and squeezed into the top 100. They felt as if they had been struck by a pie in the sky. "Why can't we find the braised chicken and rice anymore? Why isn't it in the top 30? It's not just the braised chicken and rice, the Ruggiamo, tofu pudding, and Youngju fried rice have all disappeared from the ranking list. How could this be? They were still on the ranking list yesterday. Could it be that they've been removed from the ranking list? Looks like they really have been removed from the ranking list. How could this be? It's already infuriating enough that such delicious food isn't at the top of the ranking list, but now it's completely disappeared from the ranking list. All of the customers who had come to check out the ranking list for Amy's had also erupted into an uproar. 5 of Amy's dishes had disappeared from the ranking list, and all of the customers who had invested a lot of time and effort into the ranking list during this period of time were unable to accept this. Say, is there something wrong with your ranking list? Where did Amy's go? The braised chicken and rice was still ranked 21st on the ranking list yesterday. Even if it's removed from the ranking list, the Catering Association should at least give us a proper reason. This is the Aden Square Food ranking list that prides itself on being fair and just, yet you're removing a restaurant from the ranking list for no reason at all? Don't you have any shame at all? The Catering Association office was immediately surrounded by enraged customers. In the face of a barrage of sharp questions, the employees of the Catering Association were all sweating profusely. Some of them were even wearing the uniforms of the Grey Temple and the City Lord's Castle, and cold sweat began to appear on their foreheads. Just who is this restaurant? That was the first question that appeared in everyone's minds. During the past few days, this restaurant had been constantly climbing up the rankings list as a dark horse, and they were actually quite excited. Every time they heard the customers' complaints about the Aden Square Food ranking list, they would blush slightly. As employees of the Catering Association, they had naturally heard about some of the shady details involved. However, even Vice President Robert couldn't do anything about it, so what could they do? My apologies, the removal of the ranking list is a notice from the higher-ups, and a detailed announcement will be made soon. Please forgive us. The employee could only repeat his feeble explanation with a fawning smile on his face, but he was also grumbling internally. I've been working in the Catering Association for over 20 years, and I've never seen a restaurant where the customers care so much about the restaurant. How could a restaurant like this be removed from the ranking list? I think the Aden Square Food ranking list is going to be a goner, Luther said to Alvin in a soft voice. Indeed, the savory tofu pudding is so delicious. Alvin nodded in agreement. Father, will I really be able to eat that rainbow fish when I come back at noon? Amy asked expectantly as Mag pushed his bicycle out from behind the counter. Of course. When have I ever lied to Amy? Meg nodded with a smile before exiting the restaurant with his bicycle in one hand. Chapter 341. Meg reflexively looked in the direction of the blacksmith shop, and was relieved to see that it was still standing there. Only then did he look at the agitated Harrison with a puzzled expression. Mr. Mack, your restaurant has been removed from the Aden Square Food rankings. All of the delicacies have been removed, and there's nothing left, Harrison hurriedly explained when he saw Meg's puzzled expression. It's been removed from the rankings? Meg raised an eyebrow upon hearing that. This was really beyond his expectations. Ever since he stopped the sweet and savory parties from farming 5 stars each other a few days ago, Meg felt that the mission this time would definitely succeed. However, it seemed that things weren't as simple as they seemed. Uncle Grey Fatty, are you saying that someone didn't want our restaurant to remain on the rankings? Amy walked out from behind Meg, and looked at Harrison with a displeased expression on her little face. Yeah, I think Mamis was targeted, and that's why she was removed from the rankings. Harrison nodded, and was also very angry. He had been checking the rankings every day for the past few days, and was even more attentive than his own gold shop. Now that his restaurant had been removed from the rankings, he felt as if he had suddenly lost a child that he had raised well. It was a very unpleasant feeling. The customers lining up in front of the restaurant also began to discuss among themselves. They were also very angry that Mamis had been removed from the rankings. Mr. Mack, did you offend some despicable person? Gyurge turned to Mag with a question. He was also a businessman, so he was able to see what was going on behind the scenes. Well, that's really possible. Perhaps they've offended all of the restaurants ranked below me on the rankings? Meg shook his head with a smile, and didn't appear to be too flustered or angry. The restaurant's removal from the rankings was indeed beyond his expectations. The catering association of this world was even more shameless than he had imagined. Today was already the 9th day, and he had already received his mission reward, but now, there were some uncertainties about what would happen to him. However, when it came to doing business, there would be no fun if there were no ups and downs. Meg was very open-minded about this. After all, his father had established such a huge corporation in his previous life, and it had also been on the brink of bankruptcy several times. Those who didn't have the mental fortitude to do so would probably have already climbed out of the balcony. The Catering Association's actions weren't very kind. He had spent tens of thousands of copper coins just selling the past few days, and it wasn't like him to suffer in silence. Since they were so shameless, then he might as well rip their faces off. Mammis Restaurant's face. I understand. Thank you for your concern, everyone. I won't be able to accept this so-called notice even if it's released. However, it's almost time for Amy's class, so I'll take her to class first. We'll be releasing a new dish tonight. Meg glanced at his watch with a smile on his face. He carried Amy, who was wearing a little black magician robe, onto his bicycle, and rode toward Chaos School. Mr. Mac sure has a good personality. He's been treated so unfairly, but he's still smiling and chatting with us. I think Mr. Mac doesn't care about the rankings at all. His restaurant's business is so good now, and Mr. Mac is always chasing customers away when it's closing time. He doesn't need to rely on the rankings to attract customers. That's not necessarily the case. Mr. Mac spent a lot of money buying so many tickets to get onto the rankings, which means he still wants to get onto the rankings. However, now that he's been removed from the rankings, it's going to be a problem for him to get onto the rankings again. Even though Amy has 2 teachers who are great magic casters, it's very difficult for them to influence the Catering Association's decisions. Those guys keep saying that they're waiting for an announcement from the higher-ups. Isn't the Catering Association a subordinate of the City Lord's Castle? If you ask me, Mr. Mac should go directly to the City Lord's Castle to complain and expose the ugly faces of those guys. Even though this is a little off-putting, if I didn't hear wrong, Mr. Mac said that he'll be releasing a new dish tonight, right? We have to come and try it. Yeah, I wonder what kind of food Mr. Mac will be making this time. I'm really looking forward to it. All of the customers looked at Meg's departing figure, and began to discuss spiritedly among themselves. There was no conflict between the sweet and savory factions today. What's going on? Julian slowly walked over with a hunched back, and stood at the very front of the savory faction. He overheard everyone's conversation, and asked in a hoarse voice. Mammis seemed to be in some kind of trouble. Master, Mammis has been removed from the Aiden Square Food Competition rankings, the customer behind him hurriedly said. The customer standing behind him hurriedly said. Everyone else also chimed in, and told Urian about this, hoping that he could make a decision for Mammy Restaurant. How could this be? All of Mammy's food is so delicious, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that her food is number 1. No wonder we didn't get to eat anything good when we came to the Aiden Square Food Competition rankings. 1111 said angrily as she poked Lulu again. Don't you think so, Lulu? Yes, I do. Lulu nodded as she patted 1111's head to comfort her. I think it's good to have fewer people. It's quieter. Urian pondered for a moment after hearing everyone's recount, and then turned around with a calm expression on his face. Everyone looked at Julian's departing figure, and they didn't know what to say. However, for a 10th-tier magic caster, and the renowned Lord of Ice on the Norland continent, to ask him to use his connections to help a restaurant just because of its ranking on the Aiden Square Food Competition rankings was a little overkill. By the way, if we kill all of those people from the Catering Association, won't this matter be resolved? After a brief silence, Julian turned around to everyone with a bone-chilling voice. Gulp. Everyone swallowed in unison, and fell completely silent. As expected, a powerful being's way of thinking was different. No one dared to nod in agreement. If they killed all of those people from the Catering Association, then there would be no Aiden Square Food Competition rankings in the future. Boring. Julian withdrew his gaze, and closed his eyes to rest again. Master Crassus, our restaurant has been removed from the Aiden Square Food Competition rankings. I'm so angry. Can you let us get back on the rankings? We're so pitiful. Amy turned to Crassus with a pitiable expression as soon as they arrived at the magic lab. Chapter 342. It's not that big of a deal. It's just that our restaurant was suddenly removed from the Aiden Square food competition today. Meg was given a fright by Crassus, and hurriedly explained. If he really did burn all of the people from the Catering Association to death, he and his daughter would most likely have to flee with them. Couldn't he be a little more tactful? I see. Then I'll talk to Michael for you when I have time. He might be able to help you. Crassus nodded before turning to Amy with a smile, and said, Little Amy, the convoy transporting the materials has already departed from Rodu, and will arrive at Chaos City soon. When the time comes, I'm going to build a magic castle for you with my own hands. However, those old geezers must be up to no good when they sent 3 of their little grand disciples to congratulate me after hearing that I've taken in a disciple. Hence, we have to study the spells that I'm going to teach you in the next few days, and show them the power of melee magic. Looks like I'll have to think of a way to solve this problem on my own. After exiting the school, Meg rode his bicycle to Sherlock's detective firm. To Crassus and the others, a small competition like the Aiden Square food competition was nothing compared to teaching Amy magic. Know yourself and know your enemy, and you'll never be defeated. I have to go back and do some research on the Catering Association. Perhaps I'll have to pay the City Lord's castle a visit. Meg exited Sherlock's detective firm and placed a yellow leather briefcase in the basket of his bicycle before riding back to the restaurant. Boss, what do we do now? Our restaurant has been removed from the rankings. Are we going to continue voting today? Yarbemia asked with a concerned expression as she followed Meg into the restaurant. The remaining votes are enough for the remaining 2 days of voting. Sally was also a little indignant, but she was a lot calmer than Yarbemia. Meg parked his bicycle and turned to the 2 of them with a smile, and said, Don't stop voting. Perhaps we still have a chance to turn things around. Let's put aside the matter of our restaurant being removed from the rankings for now. Don't bring negative emotions to our customers. Boss, are you really okay? Yarbemia asked worriedly as she looked at Meg. If even she was so angry, Meg must be feeling even worse. But now, he was talking to them with a smile on his face. Sally also looked at Meg in surprise. Of course it doesn't matter. The final ranking hasn't been decided yet, right? Meg smiled and shook his head. He put the documents in the basket into the drawer of the counter. He looked at the 2 and asked, What do you want to eat for breakfast? I'll make it for you. I'll release a new dish tonight. Let's try it together at noon. A new dish. Yarbemia's eyes lit up. Seeing the smile on Meg's face, his mood brightened up. He thought for a moment and said, I want a bowl of sweet tofu pudding and a rugiamo. What's the new dish this time? I want a Yeongju fried rice. Sally also looked at Meg curiously. She didn't expect Meg to release a new dish so soon after the braised chicken and rice was released. Well, you'll know at noon. Sit down and rest. I'll make breakfast for you, Meg said with a smile. He didn't tell them directly, and turned to walk into the kitchen. What kind of delicious food will it be? Yarbemia thought expectantly. He's not afraid of honor or disgrace. That's why he can constantly improve himself and make more delicious food, Sally thought to herself as she looked at Meg, who was busy in the kitchen. If Meg's delicious food was the reason why she stayed, then Meg's kind and calm personality slowly won her over. Why would such a man come to Chaos City alone with his daughter to open a restaurant? Who was the elf who gave birth to Amy? Why had Meg and Amy never mentioned her, and why had they never seen her before? Sally had many questions in her heart, but she didn't dare to ask them. After Sally and Yarbemia finished their breakfast, Meg looked at the time. It was just the right time to open the restaurant. He opened the door with a smile and welcomed the customers in. Yarbemia also had an energetic smile on her face. Sally's expression was as cold as usual, but not arrogant. She didn't lose her elegance. The customers were in a bad mood because the restaurant had been removed from the rankings. They thought the atmosphere in the restaurant would be bad. After all, the restaurant owner would be the most upset after such a thing happened. But after seeing the smiles on Meg and Yarbemia's faces, they were all cured. This was still the restaurant that made people happy. Even the arguments over different tastes were so lively and interesting. "Welcome. I hope everyone has a good morning," Meg said with a smile. He nodded at Yabemia and Sally before making his way to the kitchen. The customers were the foundation of the restaurant. He could afford to fail this mission, but Meg didn't want to affect the customers' dining experience and mood. That was not something a high-quality restaurant would do. After breakfast, Meg took off his apron. He said goodbye to Yabemia and Sally before going upstairs with the information in his cabinet. He wanted to learn more about the Catering Association before he started preparing the ingredients. Even the reviews weren't as bad as they were. There wasn't a lot of information about the Catering Association, so it only took Meg about 20 minutes to read through all of it. To put it in simpler terms, the Catering Association was a private association that had been recruited by the government, but it was still a private association that wasn't subject to any official supervision. About 40 years ago, a middle-aged man began to collect information about the restaurants in the Aden Square. He wrote a list of the restaurants and delicacies in the Aden Square based on his personal tastes. That man was the founder of the Catering Association, Laurie. The Aden Square food rankings that he wrote gradually became popular among the customers as it allowed them to quickly find all types of delicacies. At the same time, it gradually attracted more and more people who also liked food to join his team. Slowly, the Catering Association took shape, the Food Association. After over 20 years of development, the Food Association had become more and more powerful, and the Aden Square food rankings had also become more and more famous. It had almost become the benchmark for the food industry in the Aden Square. All of the restaurants and delicacies that made it to the top of the rankings would be extremely popular. After that, Laurie retired, and the Food Association, which was already beginning to take shape and had its own headquarters, was handed over to a young man by the name of Warren. This young man by the name of Warren was indeed a genius. Not long after he took office, he changed the Aden Square food rankings to a voting system by the customers. The Food Association entered a period of rapid development, but the rankings were still as effective as ever. Furthermore, it eliminated the subjective factors of the past, and it selected dishes that were more popular with the general public. It had become the most authoritative ranking in the Aden Square food industry, and a single ranking could determine the business of a restaurant. After that, the Food Association was recognized by the City Lord's Castle, and it was renamed the Catering Association. The Aden Square food rankings were officially certified, and they began to charge for tickets. The Catering Association transformed from a loose food association to a catering association that served the customers and the restaurant industry. Chapter 343. This so-called Aden Square food competition was lucky that it didn't encounter me. Otherwise, I would have been able to diss all the way from the first restaurant to the 100th without using a single curse word. Meg pursed his lips. The information at the back of the page was about the partnership between the Catering Association and the Aden Chamber of Commerce. This wasn't a secret in the Aden Square. The Chamber of Commerce had gathered all of the best shops in the Aden Square, including all types of premium restaurants. Most of them could easily make it into the top 100 in the Aden Square. However, in recent years, almost all of the top 30, and even the top 50, had been occupied by restaurants affiliated with the Chamber of Commerce. As such, it was virtually impossible for other restaurants to make it onto the rankings board. This was something that had never happened in the past, and it had drawn complaints from many businesses. However, the Catering Association always responded with a customer's choice is paramount, as a response to all of the complaints. However, only the Catering Association knew how much of this so-called customer voting was fake. According to the information provided, every month, the Aden Chamber of Commerce would issue a voting mission for the restaurants affiliated with the Aden Chamber of Commerce to maintain a high ranking on the rankings. It's the Aden Chamber of Commerce again. Those two people who were arrested were board members of the Aden Chamber of Commerce. It looks like the Aden Chamber of Commerce has something to do with my restaurant's removal from the rankings. Could it be that my restaurant has already been targeted by this colossus? Meg's brows furrowed. Even though he had threatened to dissolve the Aden Chamber of Commerce in front of Gudnia, He was well aware of just how terrifying this colossus was. It had amassed over 50% of Chaos City's economic power, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that its wealth could rival that of an entire nation. I don't think so, but it looks like my restaurant's attempt to get onto the rankings has already affected some people. If I want to get onto the rankings again, I'll have to break through the Aden Chamber of Commerce's blockade, and at the same time, I'll have to convince the Catering Association to let me onto the rankings. It's really going to be difficult to solve without killing people. Meg fell into a daze for a while, but he still couldn't come up with a solution. With his current status and power, he didn't even have the right to speak to the Catering Association, let alone the Aden Chamber of Commerce. As for Julian and Crassus, their strength was enough to make everyone wary. However, if the president of the Aden Chamber of Commerce did not want to see them, then he could refuse to see them. The City Lord's castle and the Grey Temple would stand in front of him to protect him because this was Chaos City, a city with laws and rules. In this world, the strong could obtain more respect, a better life, and a higher status and power. However, it did not mean that they could do whatever they wanted. Meg was glad that he was reborn in a world where there were rules and laws to protect his safety. Even if he was weak, he could still hold his head high and live with dignity in front of the strong. Perhaps he couldn't do whatever he wanted in a world like this, but at the very least, he could live a more interesting life. He didn't have to carefully hide away whenever he saw a demon, and be on the lookout for a sneak attack from behind. The strong had things to restrict their power, while the weak had things to protect their dignity in this world. Even though Meg could only be considered a weakling now, he was still able to garner the love and respect of his customers with his delicious food. This was not just because Crassus and Julian were Amy's teachers, but it was a feeling that he liked. In the City Lord's castle in the eastern part of the city. Please report to the City Lord that Robert from the Catering Association would like to see the City Lord. I wonder when he'll be available, Robert said to the employee in the reception room. Isn't this Sir Robert? The City Lord has just left, and according to his schedule, he should only be back at noon. Will you be waiting for him here? Or will you come back in the afternoon? The worker raised his head to look at Robert, and asked with a hint of surprise and respect in his voice. Robert had been working in the City Lord's castle for over 10 years, and his rank had been steadily rising. He had received the City Lord's approval, and barring any mishaps, he would be able to hold his own in a few years. No one would have thought that he would propose to join the Catering Association last year. Many people thought that he was trying to make a fortune out of it. After all, the Catering Association was renowned for its wealth. However, word quickly spread that he was being ostracized in the Catering Association, and that he was basically a general without an army. Many people were perplexed by this, so they thought that the City Lord was trying to temper him. He would be demoted for 2 years, and when he returned, he would be entrusted with important responsibilities. A hint of disappointment flashed through Robert's eyes as he nodded, and said, "Thank you. I'll wait then." "All right, then please come with me. I'm sure many of your acquaintances would like to catch up with you," the employee said with a smile. "It's all right, I'll wait here. It's still working hours, and catching up with me would only affect their work." Robert shook his head before finding a window seat in the reception room. He looked out the window with a grave expression, and didn't say anything. As expected, he really is as stubborn as the rumors say. The employee poured a cup of tea for Robert, and didn't say anything else. At noon, the employee from before quickly strode over to Robert, and said, "Master Robert, the City Lord has returned, and he wants to see you." "All right, thank you." Robert rose to his feet before quickly departing with the employee. He didn't even take a sip of the cup of water that had been placed beside his chair. "Robert, I heard you've been waiting for me the entire morning. What urgent matter do you have?" A burly man with a head of red hair tied casually behind his back, a long black saber hanging from his waist, and a missing pinky on his left hand strode over with a smile as he said, "Forget it, don't talk for now. I'm sure you haven't eaten yet. Come eat with me, and we'll talk as we eat." "Yes." Robert lowered his head slightly, and fell back half a step. He looked at the man who stood at the pinnacle of Chaos City, and found that he was still just as resolute and decisive as he had been when he had first met him over 10 years ago. "City Lord, I'm here today to report to you about my work at the Catering Association." At the same time, Robert sat down and turned to Michael, who was about to dig in. I actually know why you're here today. I just so happened to run into Warren when I went out this morning, and he reported many things to me. He even suggested that you leave the catering association. Michael put down his bowl and looked at Robert's frozen expression. A smile suddenly appeared on his face as he scooped up another mouthful of rice and said, "But I want to hear what you have to say. You're my man, so of course I have more faith in your words." Robert's expression lit up again, and he sat up straight as he said, "There's a new restaurant by the name of Mammy in the Catering Association's Aden Square Food Competition." Chapter 344. Is the food in that restaurant really that good? But Uncle Robert is renowned for not being able to lie. Vivian thought to herself as she eavesdropped on their conversation. She had heard from the servants that her father was back, so she came over to have lunch with him. However, she decided to eavesdrop on their conversation. That was something that she loved to do ever since she was a child. After all, nothing could be done to her even if she was caught. Mammy. Isn't that the restaurant that Luna mentioned before? I think she also said that the food in that restaurant is very good, and it's opened by the parent of one of her students. Vivian's eyes suddenly lit up as she recalled why that restaurant was so familiar. Luna had mentioned this restaurant the last time she came here. Should I go and try it? But father told me not to go out for the next few days. But if it really is as good as Uncle Robert says, then it would be a pity not to try it. A conflicted expression appeared on Vivian's face. Vivian, if you haven't eaten yet, then come in and eat. We've already talked, so there's nothing else to talk about. Michael's resigned voice sounded from inside the room. I've already eaten, so I won't disturb Father and Uncle Robert any longer. You can continue chatting, I'm just passing by. Vivian hurriedly hurried away with a panicked expression. That little girl. Michael shook his head with a resigned smile, but at the same time, there was a hint of doting in his eyes. Robert also looked out the window with a smile on his face. However, he hesitated momentarily as he looked at Michael, and asked, "City Lord, young mistress illness, it's still the same, and it seems to be getting worse. She has to use fire magic to dispel the chill every night before she can fall asleep." Michael's smile faded as he shook his head. "Young mistress is very kind, so she'll definitely be fine." Robert's expression was also rather dejected. Back when he was working at the City Lord's castle, Vivian would come to play with him from time to time. She was a very interesting little girl. "I certainly hope so." Michael nodded in response. After a brief silence, he said, "Robert, I'm aware of what you're saying. You've also told me about the Catering Association's problems on several occasions. However, back when I accepted the Food Association into the City Lord's castle, I promised Warren that I wouldn't interfere with the normal operations of the Catering Association. However, Warren made a promise to me that he wouldn't use public resources for personal gain, so I'll be sending people to investigate this matter. If I can confirm that Warren has indeed embezzled money and turned the entire Catering Association into something that serves certain restaurants, then I definitely won't let him off the hook. But City Lord, that restaurant really does have a lot of potential. If President Warren continues to target it after removing that restaurant from the rankings, then it's very likely that it won't be able to continue operating in the Aden Square. Incidents like that have happened in the past, so..." Robert was a little anxious. "Robert, my lovers from Isen Castle and their neighbors, the Orcs, are planning to hold a meeting in Chaos City to discuss the border issue. The forest trolls and goblins have engaged in another battle over an iron mine, and the forest trolls claim that the goblins have dug into their territory, while the goblins claim that the mine is in their territory, so it's not considered trespassing unless it's dug into the ground. Recently, the demons seem to have found a way to reach the Dragon Island in the Sea of Darkness, and the Dragon Island is currently discussing whether to fill up the Sea of Darkness. Hence, I've really been a little busy recently. This restaurant may be very exceptional, but I won't be able to go there to see how exceptional it is for the time being. I'll continue to follow up on the Catering Association's matters, so you can go back after you've eaten." Michael put down his empty bowl before rising to his feet. Robert looked on as the door slowly closed, and fell silent. He finished his bowl of rice before also rising to his feet and departing. He had worked in the City Lord's castle for over 10 years, so he was well aware of how much effort the City Lord had to expend to do all of these things. Even though none of these things had taken place on Chaos City's territory, all of the conflicts that took place on the Norland continent would be reported back to Chaos City. If both sides didn't want a large-scale war to break out, then they would ask Chaos City to mediate between them. Chaos City was like a neutral city that played the role of mediator, and had a unique status on the Norland continent. To Robert, Amy's was a restaurant that was worthy of his attention, but to the City Lord, the fact that he was willing to listen to Robert speak so much during his meal and make a promise to the Catering Association was already the most he could do. No matter how delicious a restaurant was, or how many powerful mags had tasted it, in the eyes of the real big shots, it was still not worth their attention. It was not something that was worth putting on the table. After a long period of fruitless contemplation, Meg decided to give up for now. Instead, he asked internally, "System, due to unforeseen circumstances, I might not be able to complete this mission. However, I already reached number 21 on the rankings board yesterday, so does that mean I've completed the mission?" Host, please don't misinterpret the mission. This mission is to have a dish enter the top 30 of the gourmet cuisine ranking and be printed on the gourmet cuisine ranking next month. If the host's restaurant is disqualified, the mission will fail, the system said seriously, without any intention to negotiate. All right, then I'll cook the grilled fish. Meg pursed his lips. The system was being stubborn, so it appeared that this mission was going to be a little difficult to complete. He placed the flour in his hands onto the chopping board, washed his hands, and made his way over to the fish tank. "Boss, is today's new dish that beautiful fish?" Yarbemia stood at the entrance of the kitchen with a curious look on her face. "That's right, that's the rainbow fish." Meg nodded with a smile. Amy had come up with a new name for the fish in the morning, and Meg felt that it sounded better than the rainbow-scaled grass carp. "This fish is so beautiful, I'm sure it'll be delicious," Yarbemia said expectantly. "Rainbow fish. What a nice name." Sally also stood at the entrance of the kitchen and looked at the fish swimming happily in the fish tank. She couldn't bear to see such beautiful fish being slaughtered and served on the dining table. "By the way, can you guys eat spicy food?" Meg turned around and asked the two of them. "I don't care how spicy it is. I'm not even afraid of super spicy food," Yarbemia said as she raised her hand. "I don't usually eat spicy food." Sally shook her head. Elves were very close to nature and rarely ate meat. Their diet also tended to be bland. "In that case, let's have the medium spicy grilled fish today. It'll be too bland if it's slightly spicy." Meg nodded with a smile. Elves usually didn't eat spicy food because they didn't have anything good to eat. Meg was confident that he could make Sally fall in love with the taste of this grilled fish. "Boss, let me help you with the fish. I'm very good at." Sally rolled up her sleeves and walked into the kitchen. However, she suddenly stopped mid-sentence with an incredulous expression on her face. A rainbow fish was scooped out of the fish tank by Meg, and then completely slaughtered by Meg's knife. He carved out a series of intricate cuts on the fish's body in a fluid motion. What was supposed to be a crude act was made by Meg to appear elegant and refined. Chapter 345. "I'm also very good at killing fish," Meg said with a smile as he rinsed the fish with water. "Boss, you're super good, much better than me." Yarbemia nodded in agreement with Meg's words. She had been cooking in the kitchen for many years, but she could never cook as well as Meg. It was as if he had practiced it thousands of times. Every movement was so elegant and natural. "All right, you two go take a seat. It will take some time to marinate the fish. I'll call you when it's done." Meg turned around and said to the two. "Boss, can I see how you cook the fish? I promise I won't steal it." "I'm just curious," Yarbemia pleaded with Meg. "Of course," Meg nodded. "Thank you, boss," Yarbemia said happily as she stood aside obediently. Warning: the host does not have the right to teach others how to cook. Please do not accept anyone's request to learn how to cook. The system's serious voice sounded. "System, didn't you hear her say she won't steal it? She's just curious. I believe in Mia's character, Just like how I believe in your lack of integrity, Meg said calmly as he began to marinate the fish. A line of words appeared in the system's mind, but it chose to remain silent in the end. Sally stood at the door and hesitated for a while, but still chose to sit outside. She supported her delicate chin with her hands and stared blankly at Meg's back in the kitchen. Roasting fish was actually a rather troublesome task, especially when it required a lot of time and energy to roast a delicious fish. Meg had already cooked the old oil before. Because it was for 4 people, Meg chose a big fish. After cooking countless times in the test field for the god of cookery, he had mastered the technique of roasting fish perfectly. The marinated fish was placed in the oven, and when it was half-cooked, he took it out and brushed it with a layer of old oil before putting it back in the oven to continue roasting. "Boss, what's this box? Why does the fish get cooked after a while?" Yarbemia couldn't help but ask curiously while pointing at the oven. "This is an oven. It's specially used to grill fish. It can also be used to grill other things," Meg explained with a smile. Things like ovens were still too advanced for this world. "I get it. It's like a closed grill." Yarbemia nodded thoughtfully. He stared at the oven for a while and asked curiously, "But this oven doesn't have a heating area. How can it heat up like this?" "This oven doesn't rely on burning charcoal to heat up. It uses electricity. The electricity is conducted into the oven through this wire, and then it heats up the heating rod inside to provide heat to the oven. This is the principle of the oven. It's similar to the principle of the lights in the restaurant," Meg explained. He had previously explained to Yarbemia and Sally how electricity worked. After all, there were electrical appliances everywhere in the restaurant. It would be bad if the 2 girls accidentally got electrocuted. "So that's how it works. Boss, you're so awesome. You've invented so many things that are so convenient and fast." Yarbemia looked at Meg with admiration, her eyes full of little stars. "Humph. They're all invented by this system." A slightly arrogant voice sounded in Meg's mind. "Life should be lived more delicately." Meg ignored the voice of the system and accepted the little girl's admiration without any hesitation. Meg took the rainbow fish out of the oven with 2 layers of old oil. Its skin had been grilled until it was golden and crispy. The tempting aroma of the fish wafted out. One could feel the freshness of the aroma. "It smells so good. I didn't know fish could be grilled like this. It's completely different from the black and hard grilled fish that I've seen before." Yarbemia looked at the grilled fish that was scooped into the iron plate by Meg and couldn't help swallowing her saliva. An aromatic aroma wafted out of the kitchen, and Sally, who was in a daze, sniffed the air, upon which her eyes also lit up. This aroma reminded her of the aroma she had tasted when she was a little girl and had gone fishing with Princess Irina at the Wind Lake. Although the grilled fish at that time didn't taste as delicious, the aroma in her memory was still unforgettable. She rarely ate fish. One reason was that fish had a lot of bones. Every time she ate fish, she would be pricked by them. Secondly, she felt that it was a little cruel to eat fish, so she would feel a little guilty when eating it. However, after hearing about this aroma, she really wanted to try this fish. A strong desire welled up in her heart, and she reflexively sat up straight as if she wanted to see just what the fish in the kitchen was like. Ugly Duckling, who was sleeping on the high stool, also opened its eyes. It turned toward the kitchen and sniffed vigorously. It stood up and poked its head out with excitement in its eyes. It was clawing at the chair impatiently with its little paws. "Father, I'm back." Amy's voice sounded from outside the door. Sally stood up and opened the door. "Hello, big sister Aisha," Amy greeted Sally before skipping into the room. Her eyes immediately lit up as she caught a whiff of the aroma. "It smells so good. Is this the aroma of fish?" Amy ran toward the kitchen on her short legs. She picked up Ugly Duckling, who was standing on the high stool, and stood on her tiptoes at the entrance of the kitchen with an expectant look in her eyes. "Father, is the rainbow fish ready? Amy and Ugly Duckling really want to eat it." Meow tilde Ugly Duckling craned its neck and stared at the grilled fish on the plate on the stove. It reached out with its 2 little paws as if it wanted to take it for its own. "Millimeter HM, it's almost ready. Go wash your hands, Amy, and sit outside. It'll be ready soon." Meg stirred the chili and pepper in the wok. After the chili and pepper were cooked, the spiciness wasn't pungent at all. Instead, there was a faint aroma that blended into the dish. All right. Amy was elated. She placed Ugly Duckling on the ground, pulled up her sleeves, and washed her hands. She then climbed onto the table where they usually ate. Sizzle. The chili and pepper were poured over the grilled fish, creating a sizzling sound. The aroma of the grilled fish quickly blended with the spicy aroma of the sauce. A smile appeared on Meg's face as he picked up a small handful of green onions and sprinkled them over the grilled fish. A perfect spicy grilled fish was completed. Boss, you really are a genius. I've never seen anyone cook fish like you, and I've never seen a fish cooked so perfectly. Yarbemia looked at Meg with reverence and admiration in her eyes. She had already been completely won over. Wash your hands and let's eat. We'll have grilled fish for lunch today, Meg said with a smile. It naturally felt good to be praised and revered. Chapter 346. The half-meter-long grilled fish's skin was golden and crispy, and its rainbow color was still faintly visible. In particular, its head and tail were still as beautiful as ever. Dark red sauce was poured over the fish, covering the onions and vermicelli underneath. Bright red dried chili peppers and Sichuan peppers were sprinkled over the fish, and tender green onions were embellished on top of the fish. Steam rose from the alcohol stove, creating a beautiful scene. Gulp. The four people sitting around the table swallowed their saliva in unison. What a beautiful fish. It's so irresistible. Even though there's a lot of chili peppers, there's no pungent spiciness to it at all. The combination of the spiciness and the aroma of the fish is so alluring. It should be fine if we only eat a little bit, right? Sally looked at the grilled fish with awe in her eyes. This was clearly an ingredient that she didn't like, but Meg's cooking made it irresistible to her. It must be super delicious. Yarbemia was also full of anticipation. She had seen with her own eyes how a live fish had been transformed into this dish by Meg's cooking. It was as if Meg's hands had magical powers. Even though she didn't recognize some of the ingredients, the ingenious combinations and innovative cooking methods had created such a delicious grilled fish. She couldn't help but exclaim in amazement, and wanted to know just what kind of delicacy it would taste like. Meow, meow. Ugly Duckling scratched at the leg of a chair with displeasure on its face, and it wanted to climb up to take a look. Let's try this spicy grilled fish. This is the new dish that we're going to release today. Let's try it ourselves first, Meg said with a smile as he picked up a piece of the most tender meat below the fish head with his chopsticks. The chopsticks sliced open the fish, and bright red sauce immediately flowed into it. The tender white fish was dyed red, and its delicious flavor was sealed away. Meg placed the fish into Amy's bowl with a smile as he said, "Be careful when you eat, there could be fish bones." Millimeter chem. Amy nodded with elation. She grabbed her chopsticks with one hand and her bowl with the other, and her little face immediately lit up when she tasted the fish. So this is what fish tastes like. It's so delicious. It's just that, it's a little spicy. The spicy sauce wrapped around the tender fish meat, and there was even a layer of crispy fish skin in the middle. Amy chewed a few times and swallowed it. She opened her mouth and stuck out her little tongue. She looked at Meg and said happily, "Father, I want more. I still want to eat fish. The fish is really delicious, and there are no bones at all. Father is the best, making such delicious fish." "Okay, I'll get more for you." Meg looked at Amy, who was sticking out her tongue like a puppy, and felt that she was simply too adorable. He picked up another piece of fish for her. Just as the system had said, this fish did not have any bones, so it was much more convenient to eat. Looking at Amy, who was enjoying the fish, Sally and Yarbemia couldn't help but reach out with their chopsticks at the same time and pick up a piece of fish. Sally looked at the piece of fish meat between her chopsticks. It would break if she used a little force, but it was still very elastic. The red sauce wrapped around the fish meat perfectly, and the spicy aroma wafted over. She couldn't help but salivate before putting it into her mouth. After a moment of hesitation, she slowly put it into her mouth. This spicy feeling. As soon as the fish meat entered her mouth, the sauce melted in her mouth. Sally felt as if there were sparks exploding in her mouth, and it also felt as if countless miniature explosive flames had exploded in her mouth at the same time. The spicy feeling was released in her mouth, and her taste buds were instantly activated. However, her tongue felt as if it had been numbed for a moment before it regained its senses. Meanwhile, the delicious flavor of the fish made Sally feel as if she had fallen into a clear, azure ocean. A large school of rainbow fish swam freely around her, and she was struck by the urge to take off her clothes and swim with them. So this unique flavor came from the ocean, and it was especially delicious. After swallowing a mouthful of fish meat, Sally felt as if a ball of fire had slid down her throat. A burning sensation instantly spread throughout her body, and she couldn't help but sit up straight and let out a soft moan. Rip! With a soft sound, one of the buttons on Sally's cheongsam burst open, revealing her fair skin and a corner of black lace. Almost at the same time, Yarbemia, who had swallowed a mouthful of fish, let out a moan. With a soft pop, two of the buttons on the front of her maid's dress popped open, revealing a seductive cleavage in her chest that was far more developed than her petite frame. What's going on? Meg, who was about to reach out his chopsticks to try the grilled fish, was taken aback by this scene. After taking a serious look, he shifted his gaze away from the two girls with a strange expression. Why did he suddenly receive the benefit of having his clothes burst open? He was sure that he hadn't spiked the food. Big sister Aisha, big sister Ma, your little bunny just came out of your clothes. Shame on you. Amy raised her head and giggled at the two girls. The two girls lowered their heads at the same time, and only then did they realize that something was wrong with their clothes. Ah! Two screams rang out at almost the same time. After a moment of confusion, the red-faced Sally and Yarbemia returned to their seats. Both of them lowered their eyes, and the atmosphere suddenly became a little awkward. Actually, I didn't see anything just now, so you don't have to worry too much about it. Meg hesitated for a moment before deciding to break the silence. Sally and Yarbemia raised their heads to look at Meg at the same time, and the word disbelief was clearly written in their eyes. They had both seen Meg's gaze linger on them for a while before he turned away. Then I'll eat first. Meg withdrew his gaze a little guiltily. Things had happened too suddenly, and he had indeed done what a normal man would do in such a situation, which was to let his gaze linger on them for a moment. He picked up a piece of fish and put it into his mouth. The rich sauce, crispy fish skin, tender fish meat, and spicy texture all whetted his appetite. Meg felt as if a key had opened up the top of his head, and he felt as if his entire body had been enlightened with just one bite. This feeling is so good. Meg swallowed the fish meat and opened his mouth to exhale. He suddenly understood what it was that he had been searching for in the old grilled fish restaurants. This was the feeling. This was the taste. This was the grilled fish. Chapter 347. If one day someone were to ask Meg why he could cook so many delicious dishes, he now knew how to answer. I've been searching for good food my whole life, until one day, I realized that the food made by others couldn't reach the standard I had in mind. So, I picked up a kitchen knife. Well, this was very pretentious. However, after tasting this grilled fish, Mag felt that this was most likely why he had chosen to pick up a kitchen knife, and why he was able to continuously practice in the tedious test field for the god of cookery. He was constantly working tirelessly to perfect a dish. In order to make a truly perfect dish in his mind, he wanted to let Amy and himself taste the true delicacies. He wanted to tell those so-called chefs who stood at the peak of a certain cuisine or a certain dish that higher standards should be the driving force to improve, and not become complaints. Thinking of this, Meg felt a little touched. Father, why are you crying? Is it because it's too spicy? Amy looked up at Meg and asked worriedly. Oh, no, it's just that this grilled fish reminded me of something. Meg blinked and wiped the tears from his eyes. He was embarrassed that he had been moved to tears. Let's eat. It's time to get back to work after dinner. Meg looked at the clock on the wall and collected his thoughts. He looked at Sally and Yarbemia and said gently. Although what had just happened was a little awkward, he didn't take it to heart. He had been through all kinds of big waves before. Moreover, to him, Sally and Yarbemia were just two little sisters who worked in the restaurant. He didn't have the slightest intention of asking Amy to change the way she addressed them from sister to stepmother. Meg wasn't a saint, but he was definitely not a casual man. In his previous life, he was able to live among hundreds of flowers without a single leaf touching him. In this life, he had Amy, so naturally, he wouldn't be too casual. Being a model stay-at-home dad was his lifelong goal. Meg was never in a hurry when it came to matters of the heart. When fate arrived, it would naturally be there. In this regard, he was still quite Buddhist. Besides, no matter what, she was still the mother of his child. Although he did not have any memories of Irina, nor did he have any feelings for her, she was still Amy's biological mother. Perhaps nothing would happen between them in the future, but before seeing her again, Meg had to at least make himself look like a decent person. He had to prove that he was taking good care of Amy and giving her a comfortable life and space to grow. This was a man's responsibility. Sometimes, Meg had to admit that he was a hypocritical person. He was not vulgar enough, but he was happy to live like this. I must have tied my clothes too loosely in the morning. Because of the delicious food just now, it accidentally fell apart. I can't blame the boss, but this is the second time I've done this in front of the boss. Mother said that if my body was seen by a man, then I would have to marry that man. If that's the case, should I marry Mr. Mac? But Mr. Mac already has Amy, so he must have a wife. If that's the case, will he abandon me? Yarbemia thought with a conflicted expression. Her gaze fell on the grilled fish on the table, and she swallowed. But this grilled fish is really delicious. If I can marry Mr. Mac, then I can eat all kinds of delicious food every day, right? If that's the case, it's really a happy thing. I don't think he saw anything, right? My grandmother said that if a man other than my husband sees my body that I shouldn't, then I should kill him or poke his eyes out. Sally glanced at Meg from the corner of her eye. She was also conflicted. But he didn't do it on purpose. Delicious food has an extraordinary effect. This is the specialty of this restaurant. This grilled fish is really special. It's delicious. Forget it. Let's eat first. The same thought flashed through Sally's and Yarbemia's minds at almost the exact same moment. They exchanged a glance before picking up their chopsticks and picking up another piece of fish. They carefully covered their chests with their hands before placing the piece of fish into their mouths. The spiciness wreaked havoc in their mouths, bringing with it an unprecedented sensation. It was different from the simple spiciness that they usually ate. This spiciness was imbued with a sense of numbness. It was very spicy, and it was also very fragrant. Paired with the fresh and delicious fish, it was an unparalleled pleasure. One chopstick after another. The simplest and most effective way to suppress the spiciness in the mouth was to keep the mouth from stopping. Therefore, the two of them couldn't stop eating at all. The sweat on their foreheads had already wet their hair, but compared to the delicious taste, this was nothing at all. As expected, delicious food is the best way to resolve awkwardness. Mag heaved an internal sigh of relief as he looked at the two of them, who couldn't stop eating. He took a glance at Ugly Duckling, who was trying to climb up his leg, and picked up its little plate with a smile. He placed 2 pieces of fish onto the plate, and placed them on the ground as he earnestly said, "Ugly Duckling, this fish is super spicy. Make sure that you can handle the spiciness before you decide whether to eat it or not. Ugly Duckling, if you eat this spicy fish, you might explode." Amy also chimed in with a serious expression. She was still sticking out her little tongue. Even though it was very spicy, it really was delicious. Meow tilde Ugly Duckling nodded its little head, and pounced on the fish impatiently. It sniffed it with its nose before taking a bite. Meow. Ugly Duckling let loose a long cry as it jumped 1/2 meter into the air. Its soft and supple fur stood on end, and it instantly transformed into a little orange furball. It bounced around on the spot like a bouncing ball, looking very adorable and amusing. Ha ha ha, Ugly Duckling, you're so stupid. Amy was convulsing with laughter. Meg also couldn't help but shake his head with a smile. Back when he was eating grilled fish in Sichuan, there was a cat in the restaurant that ate close to half of the spicy grilled fish at his feet, and it was even calmer than he was the entire time. That was why he had given Ugly Duckling some of this spicy grilled fish. However, it appeared that this little guy wasn't used to the spicy taste. Ugly Duckling jumped away from the grilled fish with a horrified expression, and only stopped after a while. Ugly Duckling, do you still want some? Amy asked. Meow tilde. Ugly Duckling hurriedly shook its head and licked its lips. It looked at the grilled fish with a conflicted expression for a long while before slowly inching closer again. It sniffed it and took a bite before transforming into a little orange furball again and jumping around in the restaurant. You're saying no, but your body is quite honest. Meg shook his head with a smile. He ignored Ugly Duckling, which was wavering between pleasure and pain, and picked up a strand of vermicelli with his chopsticks. Chapter 348. Slurp. The slippery vermicelli was sucked into Meg's mouth. The spicy sauce combined with the smooth vermicelli was simply too delicious. When eating grilled fish, Meg didn't need any other side dishes, but he had to have a portion of vermicelli. To him, vermicelli was just as important as grilled fish. Father, what's that bouncing thing? I want some too, I want some too. Amy's eyes lit up as she wheedled. This is vermicelli. It's also very delicious, Meg said with a smile as he placed 2 vermicelli into Amy's bowl. Amy picked up 1 vermicelli with her chopsticks and blew on it. Then, she sucked it into her mouth like Meg did and chewed happily. She nodded and said happily, vermicelli is super delicious. It's as delicious as fish. Although there were some twists and turns, lunch still ended in a happy atmosphere. Sally and Yarbemia were sweating profusely as they each held a glass of iced water. They took a big gulp and exhaled contentedly, completely forgetting about the awkwardness from before. Father, can I put away this fish bone? I want to show it to Daphne. Amy looked at Meg expectantly. Of course you can. Also, you can invite your friends over on your days off. I'll make some delicious grilled fish for you. Meg nodded with a smile. Daphne and Amy were very close. Speaking of which, Amy had never invited any of her friends over to play. Can I really? Daphne loves fish the most, and Jessica has never eaten fish before either. Can she come over as well? Amy's eyes lit up as she looked at Meg. Of course. As long as it's someone Amy wants to invite, it's fine. Meg nodded with a smile. That's great. Father, you're the best. Amy hugged Meg's arm and swung it back and forth with a happy expression on her little face. When Sally and Yarbemia saw this scene, a gentle smile appeared on their faces. Meg doted on Amy too much. It was a blessing to have such a father. Then I'll help you put away the fish bones. Mag stood up and used his chopsticks to pick out the fish bones from the plate carefully. This fish only had a main bone and some thick and hard bone spurs evenly distributed on the main bone. The flesh of the fish had been eaten very cleanly. Even the fish head only needed to be washed with water, and it could be made into a complete fishbone specimen. What a fragrant smell of fish. Mr. Mac, is the new dish tonight related to fish? Yeah, it's not just the smell of fish, but also a rich spicy smell. This smell is simply amazing. I want to eat it. I also like spicy food. I thought Mr. Mac's dishes were more light. Looks like we're in for a treat this time. The restaurant opened for business, and the customers walked in. Soon, the customers noticed the smell in the air and asked one after another. Yes, tonight's new dish is related to fish. However, we'll find out what it is tonight. Meg nodded with a smile. He didn't reveal too much about the new dish. Father won't be having dinner at home tonight. It shouldn't be a problem for me to sneak out for dinner, right? In the backyard of the City Lord's mansion, Vivian, who had changed into a luxurious blue male outfit, looked around. Her beautiful long hair was casually tied up with a piece of cloth, and 2 delicate handlebar mustaches were pasted on her upper lip. She had transformed into a handsome young master. After making sure that there was no one around, Vivian stepped onto a large tree beside the wall of the courtyard. She then gently tapped her foot on the wall, and landed outside the tall wall of the City Lord's mansion. She quickly walked away from the wall, and only then did she walk down the street with a calm expression. There weren't many people on the street, and no one had noticed that Vivian had climbed over the wall of the City Lord's mansion. She took a deep breath of the free air outside. It was still early anyway, so she leisurely made her way toward the Aiden Square. His Sconard was standing by the window of a restaurant on the second floor. He was wearing a set of lavish red robes, and he swirled the wine glass in his hand as he looked at Vivian with narrowed eyes. He had seen this woman climb over the wall of the city lord's mansion with his own eyes. His gaze lingered on Vivian's face for a while, and his eyes suddenly lit up as he murmured to himself, "Isn't that young Mistress Vivian? I was wondering who dared to climb over the wall of the city lord's mansion. Looks like it's young Mistress Vivian who went out to play in men's clothes. I didn't get to talk to her much at the banquet a few days ago, but this is a good opportunity. It's going to be dark soon, so perhaps I can find an opportunity to take young Mistress Vivian home. Perhaps I'll be able to leave a good impression on the city lord, and show father that his son isn't just a playboy." Sconard put down his wine glass, and bade farewell to his friends in the private room before going downstairs. Sconard's father was the ambassador of the Roth Empire in Chaos City, so he had snuck into the banquet at the city lord's mansion a few days ago. He had fallen in love with the beautiful young Mistress Vivian at first sight, but she didn't seem to be very interested in him, and only exchanged a few polite words with him. Over the past few days, he had sought out his best friends to inquire about Vivian, but most of them told him to give up as soon as possible. Miss Vivian was a well-bred young lady who had been raised in the city lord's boudoir. She rarely went out and would not easily interact with other men. A woman who dares to climb over the wall in men's clothes isn't some wealthy young mistress who doesn't dare to interact with men. Perhaps she's a wild horse. Sconard hid behind a tree, and a faint smile appeared on his face as he looked at Vivian, who was looking around. If he could win the favor of this city lord's only daughter, then he would be able to hold his head high in front of his father, who had always looked down on him. His family was rich through the trade between the two major cities. "Is this the place? It looks nice, but it's so crowded. Looks like I have to share a table with all kinds of strange people." Outside Amy's, Vivian stopped in her tracks and looked at the restaurant through the floor-to-ceiling windows. There were still people lining up in the middle of the aisle, and her brows furrowed slightly. She didn't discriminate against any race, but she was a clean freak, so she didn't want to eat at the same table with men she didn't know, especially dwarfs and orcs who didn't like cleanliness. "Should I go in?" Vivian hesitated for a long while. All of a sudden, a customer opened the door, and the rich aroma of fish and spicy food wafted out before being cut off by the automatic closing of the door. Vivian gulped as she walked toward the restaurant. As she reached out to grab the door handle, she didn't forget to say to herself, "I didn't go in because I was attracted by the aroma of the fish. I just heard from Uncle Robert that it would be a pity for such a restaurant to be neglected, so I decided to come in and check it out." Chapter 349. From the outside, Vivian had thought that the restaurant would be filled to the brim with people, but after entering the restaurant, she was surprised to find that it was quite quiet. Aside from the occasional compliment from the customers, even those who were close to her were speaking in hushed tones. "Even the orcs have learned to whisper." Vivian looked at the two orcs who were whispering to each other, and raised an eyebrow. She had never seen such a scene in any other restaurant. Furthermore, orcs and elves were sitting at the same table in this restaurant, while demons and dwarfs, who had been in serious conflict recently, were sitting next to each other and eating without fighting. Vivian, who had grown up in Chaos City, couldn't believe her eyes. What had made them abandon their beliefs? However, her gaze was soon drawn to the big red fish on a burning iron plate on the table next to her. The spicy aroma and rich fish aroma were perfectly blended together, and steam was wafting toward her nose. It was the same aroma that she had smelled at the door. Fish had been her favorite food ever since she was a child. Even though she hated picking out fish bones the most, that didn't stop her from having fish on her table for every meal. She had eaten a lot of fish since she was young, but she had never seen a fish cooked like this. The whole fish seemed to have been roasted, but it didn't look like a fish cooked with charcoal. It was covered with a layer of bright red sauce, and there was also a layer of chopped red chili on top. The orc next to her picked up his chopsticks and put a piece of fish into his mouth, and his eyes widened as if he had tasted something incredible. His face turned from green to red, and he opened his mouth as if he wanted to spit out the fish, but he was reluctant to do so. He hesitated for a while before swallowing, and then heaved a sigh of satisfaction. After taking 2 quick breaths, the orc picked up another piece of fish and put it into his mouth. It was obviously spicy, but he couldn't bear to spit it out. His face was soon covered in sweat, but the chopsticks in his hand didn't seem to be able to stop. He took one bite after another, and his face was full of joy. Gulp. Vivian swallowed again. She was actually salivating while watching an orc eat. Even she found it hard to believe. His table manners weren't good-looking and were even a little vulgar, but he was eating with relish. The feeling of being completely immersed in the delicious food. What kind of Tao could make people so intoxicated? And this fish doesn't seem to have any small bones. What surprised Vivian even more was that the orc did not spit out any bones when he ate the fish. How could the fish not have small bones? Right at this moment, a gentle voice interrupted Vivian's train of thought. "Dear customer, there's a seat over there. You can sit down and enjoy your meal." Vivian turned to look at Yarbemia with a hint of surprise in her eyes. She hadn't seen a half-dragon waitress in a restaurant in the Aden Square in a long time. However, this girl was really beautiful, especially the smile on her face. It seemed to have a special charm that made people's moods brighten. Moreover, the dress she was wearing was also very special. Was this a new style that came out recently? Vivian thought to herself. She was going to ask Luna to go shopping with her next time. Even though Yarbemia had already gotten used to receiving customers, she still couldn't help but blush slightly as a handsome young man stared at her. This young man was really handsome, and he also had a mustache just like the owner of the restaurant. However, she still felt that the owner of the restaurant was more handsome and manly in her eyes. Vivian also realized that it wasn't very polite of her to stare at him, so she withdrew her gaze and turned to look at a dwarf couple who had just stood up and left. Only the bones of the grilled fish remained on the metal plate, and the table and chairs were covered in grease. Vivian's brows furrowed when she saw the red grease stains. Right at this moment, Sally quickly strode over and put away the grill and plates. She then unleashed a water ball spell on the table, and the grease stains on the surface of the table and chairs were instantly cleaned. It was much cleaner than using a rag. A water elven magic caster used a waitress to clean tables. The owner of this restaurant is a genius. Vivian's eyes immediately lit up, and she made her way over to the table before gently wiping her finger across the surface of the table. There wasn't any grease or water stains on her slender fingers, and even she couldn't find anything to nitpick on. Even though there weren't any private seats available, she really couldn't find any fault with the service. It was worthy of a 5-star rating. "I'd like that fish," Vivian said as she pointed at the grilled fish on the table beside her. "That's the spicy grilled fish. Please take a look at the menu and choose the size and flavor of the grilled fish," Yarbemia said with a smile as she gestured to the menu on the table. "I can choose the size and flavor." Vivian picked up the menu with a surprised expression. The leather cover was very comfortable to touch. Before Vivian had a chance to flip open the menu, a voice sounded from behind her. "There's no need to look at the menu. Just order all of the dishes you have here. As for this fish, I want the biggest and tastiest one." Sconard made his way over to Vivian with a smile, and said, "I feel like fate has brought us together, so let me treat you to this meal." "There's no need for that, I have my own money." A hint of displeasure flashed through Vivian's eyes as she turned down Sconard. Wasn't this the guy who had tried to pester her at the banquet the other day? He was wearing a vulgar red robe, and she didn't think that she would encounter him here again. However, she had already changed her disguise, so he most likely wouldn't be able to recognize her, right? As such, Vivian wasn't flustered in the slightest. The spicy grilled fish isn't a matter of whether it's delicious or not. Instead, it's a matter of how spicy the dish is. "Please choose the flavor based on how spicy the dish is," Yarbemia said with a smile. Yarbemia said with a smile. She didn't have a good impression of this pompous young master. Chapter 350. As soon as Sconard's voice trailed off, everyone in the restaurant turned to look at him with intense hostility in their eyes. What a joke! If they weren't allowed to eat at Mammoth, they would be sworn enemies. However, This was the first time they had heard of someone trying to reserve the entire restaurant after eating at Immerse for so long. They wondered what Master Julian, who was currently enjoying his grilled fish, would think about this. With that in mind, everyone turned to look at Sconard with a hint of intrigue in their eyes. Perhaps his family was rich, but there were no less than 10 people sitting in Immerse who were just as rich as his father, or perhaps even richer. There were also no less than 20 people who could kick him out of the restaurant with a single slap. I also like some peace and quiet. Urian raised his head to look at Sconard, and nodded in agreement. However, he didn't do anything as he continued to eat the grilled fish in front of him. The spicy sensation made him feel as if he had already lost all feeling in his tongue, but he could still taste the delicious flavor. Of course, what was even more surprising to him was that after swallowing the fish, a scorching sensation spread throughout his entire body. His legs, which had stiffened from the cold, were also feeling warm, and the cold was being forced out of his body in a steady stream. His bent back also felt as if it could straighten up a little. Julian had tried many methods to ward off the cold, such as sleeping on a bed that was made from a piece of 10,000-year firestone that he had dug out from the bottom of a lava lake, and drinking a cup of flame fruit juice every day, but none of them were very effective. The cold that had accumulated over the years had already seeped deep into his bones, and couldn't be removed with normal methods. He didn't have many years left to live anyway, so Urian couldn't be bothered to do this for the next few years. However, the Ruggiamo from before had given him a glimmer of hope, and Mag's new spicy grilled fish had also given him a glimmer of hope that he could completely dispel the chill in his body. The scorching sensation had seeped deep into his bones, and was burning away all of the excess moisture in his body. This process wasn't very intense, but he could clearly sense that the cold was receding, and the pain in his back and legs had been mostly alleviated. As long as he continued to eat, it wouldn't take long for the cold to be completely removed from his body, and perhaps his back would also be able to return to normal. Although he didn't have many years left to live, if he could live a more comfortable life, why not? Furthermore, he only needed to eat this delicious grilled fish. In the future, he would come to eat one every day. That was settled. Sconard took a glance at Julian, but didn't take this hunchbacked old man seriously. He enjoyed the feeling of being stared at by so many pairs of eyes. Of course, this was Chaos City, after all, and he knew that he had to keep a low profile. As such, he only asked the owner of the restaurant to invite Julian over, and he would even pay enough to book the entire restaurant. He felt like what he was doing was very gentlemanly and generous. Vivian was the daughter of the city lord, so of course she couldn't dine with demons and dwarfs. Sconard couldn't help but feel a little excited at the thought of being able to dine with Vivian. He was most likely going to leave a good impression on her. Is he an idiot? Vivian looked up at Sconard. She only wanted to have a simple meal, but who would have thought that this guy would jump around like a clown in front of her? Furthermore, she was wearing men's clothing, yet this guy was trying to curry favor with her. Vivian was feeling a little strange, and she withdrew her gaze from Sconard with a complex expression as she thought to herself, could it be that this guy likes men? With that in mind, a chill ran down Vivian's spine, and she reflexively tried to distance herself from this guy. What do you think? Sconard looked at Yarbemia with a smug expression, and raised his voice slightly in an attempt to appear more domineering and teach this half-dragon girl a lesson. Well, Yarbemia was at a loss for what to do as she looked at Sconard. She had never encountered a situation like this before, so she didn't know what to do. This customer was clearly very rich, so she didn't want to offend him. My apologies, sir, but our restaurant doesn't have a reservation service. Right at this moment, Meg emerged from the kitchen with a plate of Yangju fried rice. He placed it on the table beside him before making his way over to Yarbemia with a smile, and said, also, our restaurant is very expensive, so you might not be able to afford a reservation. All of the customers smiled upon hearing Meg's words. Mr. Mac was indeed Mr. Mac, even his rebuttal sounded so pleasant. That's right, Mammis was very valuable. Vivian looked up at Meg with a hint of surprise, and her eyes lit up. It appeared that this was the genius chef that Robert had been talking about, as well as the interesting student's parent that Luna had been talking about. His short brown hair was clean and tidy, and his mustache gave his chiseled face a hint of a ruffian. His chef's suit was tailored to fit him perfectly, and it didn't give off the feeling of being greasy as normal chefs. Instead, it gave off a clean and comfortable feeling. He does look like a decent chef. Full marks for that mustache, Vivian thought to herself. Compared to the mature yet slightly ruffian Meg, Sconard, who was dressed in a red robe and spoke in a childish manner, was completely unattractive. I'm only here to comment on his appearance, and I'm here to eat. I have no interest in this man at all. Vivian withdrew her gaze. However, she was quite pleased to hear Meg's insults toward Sconard. She didn't think that there would be such an interesting boss. Not only did he reject the offer to reserve the restaurant, he even added, "You can't afford a reservation. You're the boss." Sconard faltered slightly upon hearing Meg's words. He didn't think that his request would be rejected, and he was even mocked by this guy. If he were to let this matter rest, then the image that he had just built up in front of Vivian would be destroyed again. Sconard turned to Meg with a dark expression, and said, "I might have more money than you think. I'm reserving this restaurant for sure, just tell me how much it'll cost." This was a small restaurant on the edge of the Aden Square, so even though there were a lot of customers, it couldn't be that expensive. In the worst-case scenario, he could just pay for everyone's meal. He had a lot of gold coins and dragon coins in his purse, so it should be enough to cover the cost. Chapter 351. 1,200,000 copper coins. Sconard stared at Meg with an incredulous expression on his face. He raised his voice as he said, "Boss, have you gone insane? Do you think you're driving a Duca's restaurant?" Sconard had only expected to pay around 10,000 to 20,000 copper coins. Even though it was a little painful for him to fork out half a month's worth of pocket money, it was worth it as long as he could win Vivian's favor. However, Meg had asked for 120,000 copper coins right off the bat. This was an exorbitant price, and he had clearly explained the composition of the 120,000 copper coins. Furthermore, he had clearly stated that he only wanted cash. What kind of idiot would bring over 1,000,000 copper coins with him for a meal? All of the customers in the restaurant were also quite astonished. The restaurant was doing so well, and the price of the dishes was very high, so everyone could guess that the restaurant's turnover must be very high. However, no one had calculated the exact amount, but judging from Meg's words, it was most likely close to 1,000,000 copper coins. Among all of the restaurants in the Aden Square, even the number one restaurant, Duca's restaurant, might not necessarily be able to achieve a turnover of 1,000,000. This is already a discounted price. Meg shrugged with a smile, and said, "Also, I'm not selling." A burst of laughter instantly erupted in the restaurant, and all of the discomfort that had been caused by that young man's words were instantly alleviated. In terms of flexing, Mag was countless times better than Sconard in just a few sentences. "You're still a big shot, after all. PFFFT. Vivian also couldn't help but burst into laughter. This restaurant owner was so interesting. He didn't even use a single vulgar word when insulting others, but it really was very satisfying. However, she immediately discovered that her laughter didn't seem to suit the current situation. She put on a serious expression before chortling heartily, venting all of her pent-up frustration. "You." Sconard's face immediately flushed red. He felt as if his cheeks were burning as he listened to the customer's laughter. In particular, Vivian's laughter made his heart burn with rage. He had initially planned to show off his charm and grace, but now, he had become a laughingstock. He had been in Chaos City for 2 years, and this was the first time he had been humiliated like this. Meg picked up a menu and placed it in Sconard's hands with a serious expression. "You can take a look at the menu first. I think it's more feasible for you to order all of the dishes on the menu. As for the spicy grilled fish, there are 4 different flavors, and I personally suggest that the insanely spicy one suits your temperament better. I'd like to see what your restaurant is selling. How dare you ask for 120,000? Sconard swallowed the words that he was about to say, and flipped open the menu in an exasperated manner, upon which his eyes widened again. He leaned closer to take a look, and turned to Meg with a peculiar expression as he asked, "Boss, is there something wrong with the menu?" For someone like Sconard who frequented high-end restaurants, it was normal for 1 or 2 of their signature dishes to be more expensive. However, The cheapest tofu pudding on the menu was 200 copper coins, while the braised chicken and rice were 800 copper coins. As for the most expensive dish, the spicy grilled fish, even a small portion would cost 1,200 copper coins, while a large portion would cost 2,000 copper coins. Duca's restaurant, which was the #1 restaurant in the Aden Square, was selling a whole roast lamb for 2,500 copper coins, but a whole roast lamb was enough for 6 people to eat. Furthermore, they also provided free alcohol, and it was ranked #1 on the Aden Square. Even a random roast fish from this restaurant that wasn't on the Aden Square was priced at 2,000 copper coins. Even the largest roast fish would only be enough for 4 people at most. The prices on the menu are the same for all of the customers, so there's no problem with that. Meg shook his head with a smile. He loved to see them yelling at one another as if they had never seen the world. These prices. Vivian opened her menu, and a hint of surprise also appeared on her face at the sight of the prices. She thought to herself for a moment before nodding as she thought to herself, if it's delicious, then it's not that expensive. However, with such a high price and such a high volume of customers, even if some customers only order the cheapest tofu pudding, this restaurant's revenue is still going to be insane. It's definitely one of the top restaurants in the Aden Square. It's hard to imagine that this restaurant has only been open for less than a month. If it continues to expand in the future, it won't be difficult for it to surpass Duca's restaurant and become the #1 restaurant in the Aden Square. Vivian looked up at Meg. Not only had this man ruined the Aden Square's food and beverage rankings this month, he was most likely going to disrupt the entire food and beverage industry in the Aden Square in the near future. Is it really that good? I have to try it to believe it. I'd like a medium spicy grilled fish, and a sweet tofu pudding. Vivian closed the menu, and looked at Meg with a serious expression as she said, I hope the dishes are worthy of the price. Meg looked at Vivian with a smile, and his gaze lingered on her neck for a moment before he replied, I've always set the price of each dish as my goal. I'm sure you'll be satisfied. Sconard had clearly reserved the entire restaurant in order to impress this young man with a mustache. He had initially thought that Sconard was gay or something, but it appeared that this so-called young man was most likely a woman in disguise. Her breasts were either flat, or she had used some sort of method to conceal her breasts. Sconard most likely recognized her. Could it be that he recognized me? A hint of wariness flashed through Vivian's heart. I'd also like a large spicy grilled fish, and the flavor is. Sconard turned to Meg. He didn't have 120,000 copper coins on him, and even if he did, he wouldn't be willing to use a year's worth of pocket money to reserve the restaurant. Furthermore, Meg had no intention of allowing him to reserve the entire restaurant, so it would be unbecoming of him if he continued to pester him. He had already failed in his flexing attempt, so he had to minimize the impact as much as possible. Even though he didn't normally eat spicy food, he couldn't back down in front of Vivian. He gritted his teeth as he said, I'd like the insanely spicy one. All right, please wait a moment. Meg smiled as he turned and made his way toward the kitchen. The insanely spicy dish was referred to as insanely spicy because it wasn't something that normal people could handle. The spicy grilled fish was insanely spicy. Even Meg couldn't help but express his condolences for Sconard's stomach and anus. Even though he loved spicy food, he was still in awe of the insanely spicy dish, and under normal circumstances, he wouldn't touch it. Yarbemir heaved an internal sigh of relief before making his way to the next customer. No matter what it was, as long as Meg was here to take care of it, then everything would be fine. All of the customers also withdrew their gazes and continued to immerse themselves in the delicious food before them. As expected, there was no need to worry about being chased out of Mr. Mac's restaurant as Mr. Mac wasn't tempted at all. Chapter 352. System, my clothes are going to explode if I eat the medium spicy dish. Will I explode if I eat the insanely spicy dish? Meg was a little concerned. The spicy grilled fish had been extremely popular among the customers, but most of them had ordered the mildly spicy and medium spicy dishes. Julian was the only one who ordered the super spicy dish, and after taking his first bite, a cloud of steam rose up from his entire body, creating a mystical atmosphere in the corner of the restaurant. Even Meg was a little stunned. As for the insanely spicy dish, that was the first one he'd ordered. Please don't question the safety of the ingredients provided by the system. The system's serious voice sounded before it continued. The ingredients for the spicy grilled fish have all been optimized and nurtured by the system. The iridescent scale grasscarp is a combination of the outstanding characteristics of grasscarp and large yellow croaker, and is rich in protein and trace amounts of selenium, which can slow down aging and replenish nutrients. The small Chaotian chili pepper is a cross between high-quality millet chili and Chaotian peppers, and is grown on the poison flame island of the Demon Islands. It's roasted by poisonous flames once a day to filter out the poisonous gases and absorb the heat imbued within the poisonous flames, so it's very effective in dispelling cold energy. The icy heart pepper is grown in the northernmost region of the Roth Empire, and it's spicy yet slightly cold. Cooking them together can effectively neutralize the heat in the small Chaotian chili pepper and prevent excessive consumption of it from harming the body. That's why you're charging 600 copper coins for a small grilled fish. Meg pursed his lips. He felt a lot more at ease after hearing the system's introduction. It appeared that even the insanely spicy dish wouldn't cause any harm to the body. The price of the dish is at least twice that of the ingredients, so the higher the price, the more you'll like it. The system's disdainful voice sounded. Who said that? I want to bring delicious food to everyone, but life is so difficult, so I can only set the price like this. Meg put on a serious expression before placing the 2 portions of grilled fish into the oven, and continuing to cook the braised chicken and rice. Father, Ugly Duckling ate all of my fish bones, can I beat it up? Amy was holding a box in one hand and Ugly Duckling in the other as she stood at the door with an angry expression. Mag turned around. The box in Amy's hand was the one he had made for her in the afternoon to store the fish bones. However, the fish bones that were originally fixed in the box were now left with only the main bone and the fish head. Meow tilde Ugly Duckling raised its head and cried for help at Meg with a pitiful expression. However, it didn't sound very confident, so it appeared that it really was the culprit. Symbolically teach it a lesson. Meg looked at the fish bone, and couldn't help but burst into laughter. He had spent a lot of time cleaning and tidying the fish bone before carefully fixing it with a needle and thread. He didn't think that Ugly Duckling would gnaw on it to such an extent. It appeared that he had underestimated a cat's desire for fish. Meow, meow tilde Ugly Duckling still wanted to save itself, but Meg had already turned around. He had no intention of saving it. All right. After getting Meg's permission, Amy nodded solemnly. She put the box in her hand aside, and then put Ugly Duckling on the high stool. She pinched Ugly Duckling's chubby face with both hands, and said with a serious expression, Ugly Duckling, do you know what you did wrong? Meow tilde Ugly Duckling hurriedly nodded, and looked at Amy pitifully with its big sapphire eyes. What did you do wrong? Amy asked again. Ugly Duckling turned to look at the fish bones in the box on the ground, and pointed at them with its little paw with a reluctant look in its eyes. Do you think you left some for me? Remi turned its face back to her. Meow tilde Ugly Duckling nodded subconsciously, but then quickly shook its head. Ugly Duckling, you really thought that? Amy was a little angry. She put her little hands on Ugly Duckling's face and rubbed its head angrily. What an obedient kitten. What an adorable little half-elf girl. Vivian looked at Amy and Ugly Duckling, and her eyes immediately lit up. She looked at Amy from head to toe. She had to be the little half-elf girl named Amy that Luna often mentioned. They're very adorable, but I definitely don't want to hug them. Naughty children are the most annoying. Vivian quickly withdrew her gaze, and thought to herself. All of the customers were also looking at this scene with benevolent smiles on their faces. Aside from Mr. Mac's unforgettable food, it was also very interesting and heartwarming to see Amy play with her little orange kitten. Both of them were so adorable, and no matter what they did, they were very adorable. Sconard sat across from Vivian, and opened his mouth several times, only to shut it obediently at the sight of Vivian's serious expression. He was usually very eloquent in front of women, but he didn't dare to say anything in front of Vivian today. Vivian's status was one of the reasons why he didn't dare to say anything, and another reason was that she was wearing men's clothing, so he didn't know whether to treat her as a man or a woman. Vivian's gaze lingered on Amy for a while before quickly turning away, and it appeared that she didn't like children. Sconard's eyes lit up, and he smiled as he said, "Naughty children are the most annoying. I have to teach them a lesson almost every day to teach them how to behave. They're so adorable, and they're only teaching naughty kittens a lesson. How did they become naughty children?" Vivian pursed her lips as she looked at Sconard, and said, "Besides, before teaching others how to behave, shouldn't they learn how to behave first?" Sconard was a little displeased to be mocked by Vivian, but he still forced himself to restrain himself as he said, "Kittens are so small, what can they know? Even though they did something bad, shouldn't they be forgiven under these circumstances? Even little girls know that they have to be punished for their mistakes. They have to teach them to correct their mistakes." Vivian pursed her lips and didn't say anything else. She had no interest in this young master of the Roth Empire's ambassador's family. He was just an arrogant and boring person. In comparison, the owner of this restaurant was a lot more interesting. "Looks like the insanely spicy level isn't enough." Meg tossed another handful of fish into the pot. He was also very adept at teaching naughty children a lesson, especially naughty children like this one who hadn't been taught well since they were young. "Here's your grilled fish, please enjoy." Yarbemia placed a medium-sized grilled fish in front of Vivian with a smile on her face. "Thank you." Vivian nodded as her attention was completely drawn to the grilled fish in front of her. The fish was about the size of a palm, and was around 30 centimeters in length. It was enough for 2 people to eat. The rich aroma of fish and spicy fish wafted toward her, and she couldn't help but swallow involuntarily. Gulp. Sconard also swallowed involuntarily. Even though he was skeptical of Meg's pricing, he had to admit that the aroma wafting from this fish was simply too alluring. Chapter 353. A rich spicy aroma wafted through the air, and the large grilled fish in front of Sconard instantly attracted the attention of all of the surrounding customers. Everyone had witnessed the insanely spicy grilled fish's insanely spicy flavor, but no one had ordered it yet. The large grilled fish that was around half a meter in length took up almost half of the table, and there was a layer of red chili on top of it. Only the head and tail of the fish could be seen, and just the sight of it was enough to make one's mouth go dry. Furthermore, the rich spicy flavor of the grilled fish struck one with a sense of awe. It really was insanely spicy. Meg had recommended the insanely spicy dish to him, and he had actually ordered it. He really was a true warrior. The only question was how he would react after tasting it. There was an orc who had just eaten the medium spicy dish, and his belt had snapped in half. Vivian was also a little surprised to see Sconard's grilled fish. Her body didn't allow her to eat too much chili. In other words, she wasn't supposed to eat anything spicy or stimulating at all. However, she had been craving the bland food at home every day. It wasn't easy for her to come out, so she naturally had to eat something with some flavor. However, this insanely spicy dish clearly didn't suit her. Even though it was most likely impossible for her to recover from this illness, she still wanted to live a few more years and eat more delicious food. If her body allowed it, she really wanted to try this insanely spicy dish to see just how insanely spicy it was. Sconard looked at the bright red grilled fish in front of him, and the overwhelming spicy flavor made it difficult for him to even open his eyes. He suddenly regretted ordering the insanely spicy dish. It was way too spicy. However, he quickly sensed that everyone was looking at him with reverence in their eyes. Even Vivian seemed to be looking at him in a different light, and that gave him a boost of morale. He flung his half-length red hair aside, and a nonchalant expression appeared on his face. He picked up a piece of fish with his chopsticks, and the piece of fish was completely enshrouded in the vibrant red sauce before he slowly fed it to his mouth. Many customers in the restaurant put down their chopsticks and looked at Sconard. In the kitchen, Meg was scooping the Yangju fried rice into a bowl, and he was also looking at Sconard with great interest. He also wanted to know how the insanely spicy dish would react. Vivian's outstretched chopsticks faltered momentarily before slowly withdrawing them as she looked at Sconard with raised eyebrows. She didn't think that Meg had any good intentions in recommending the insanely spicy dish to him. Sconard appeared to be a mild-tempered man, but he was definitely not an honest man. Sconard was very happy to be the center of attention. Even Even though it was a little awkward that he had failed to reserve the entire restaurant, he had successfully attracted Vivian's attention by ordering the insanely spicy dish that no one else dared to order. "Isn't it just a little more chili? Here, let me conquer this so-called insanely spicy," Sconard declared with a disdainful expression before placing the piece of fish into his mouth. Boom! The spicy sauce melted in his mouth, and Sconard felt as if a voice had suddenly exploded in his mind. He was completely dumbstruck for a long while before coming to his senses. He then felt as if his tongue had gone completely numb from the tip to the base of his tongue, and a scorching sensation spread throughout his mouth. It was as if what he had just eaten wasn't a piece of fish, but a mouthful of boiling lava instead. The scorching sensation coexisted with the numbness, and his entire mouth felt as if it didn't belong to him anymore. He couldn't even spit out the fish, and his mouth could only chew on it in an unconscious manner. He bit into the fish, and the tender flesh melted in his mouth under the spicy sauce. Even though his mouth was completely numb, he could still clearly taste the freshness of the flesh and the crispness of the skin. Even though the scorching sensation wasn't alleviated by this, the delectable taste made him forget about the spicy sensation, and he desperately wanted to suppress the spiciness with delicious flavor. In the instant that the piece of fish entered Sconard's mouth, all of his red fur stood up on end as if it had been electrocuted. His face turned from white to red, then to green, then back to red again. It was like a traffic light, and it was quite a comical sight to behold. What was even more miraculous was that there was smoke rising from his head, and it was as if his red fur had been set ablaze. Wow, a red-haired lion that can emit smoke. That's so cool. Amy just so happened to turn around and catch sight of this, and she clapped her little hands with her mouth slightly agape. PFFFT. Vivian burst into laughter upon hearing this. This little girl was so adorable that she couldn't help but want to give her a hug. Insanely spicy really is insanely spicy. Even his head is smoking. But this guy's new nickname is probably Red Lion, right? Wrong, you forgot to add smoking. That's the main point. Ha ha ha, little boss is so adorable. I really want to steal her away. That's a very dangerous thought, young man. He has two great magic casters watching from the back. After this, he'll probably never want to eat chili again. Looks like he has to keep a low profile in front of Mr. Mac. Otherwise, if he were to be recommended insanely spicy, he'd definitely finish it even if he had to cry. All of the customers burst into laughter upon seeing this. This Sconard had requested the insanely spicy dish himself, so he could be considered a perfect example of a failure at flexing. Insanely spicy isn't as simple as adding a little more chili. Meg glanced at the half-sliced black chili beside him. This was the legendary insanely spicy chili. Just as its name implied, it was an insanely spicy chili. It was a version of the insanely spicy chili that the system had modified using the poisonous tongue of the Noggers. Aside from the fact that it contained an extremely high amount of capsaicin, the system had also modified the chili to greatly reduce its irritation and damage to the human body. However, since it was called insanely spicy, there were naturally some side effects, but they were all within an acceptable range for the human body. I'll just have to give this brat a small punishment, and he should know how to behave. Meg withdrew his gaze with a smile and continued to cook. Sconard could hear the laughter of the customers and Vivian, and he was a little frustrated. He didn't think that he would still underestimate this chili. However, he had no time to think about anything else now. He quickly picked up a piece of fish with his chopsticks and placed it into his mouth. His mouth had already become completely numb, and only the delicious fish could slightly suppress the scorching sensation. The fish was simply too delicious, and Sconard had never tasted such delicious fish in his life. It was so delicious that he couldn't stop himself, nor did he want to. Tears began to flow uncontrollably from his eyes. Spiciness and deliciousness coexisted, pain and joy, and tears streamed down Sconard's face as he ate. He had already completely forgotten that he was trying to establish a gentlemanly image in front of Vivian. Chapter 354. Rip. Vivian could clearly hear the sound of cloth tearing, and her hand that was holding her chopsticks immediately stiffened. She looked down to find that her flat chest was slowly bulging like a balloon, and her eyes slowly widened. She hurriedly pulled her loose robe forward and leaned forward to hide her discomfort. How could this be? Vivian felt as if her brain were trembling, and a blush appeared on her face. She had spent a lot of time wrapping her breasts in order to put on her dashing male attire, but her cloth had been torn apart as soon as the spicy grilled fish entered her mouth. What was she going to do? This is super weird, okay? What was added to the grilled fish? Not only did it make Shonda's hair stand on end, it even tore apart her cloth. If she were to wear loose clothes that were easy to undo, wouldn't her clothes be torn apart as well? This was an indecent dish. He undid the buttons with one hand and quickly undid his outer shirt. He leaned forward slightly. Although his posture was a little awkward, his clothes weren't too tight. At least, it didn't look too abrupt and it wouldn't be easy to notice the abnormality in his chest. The sound of cloth tearing was very soft, and Shonda was completely immersed in the insanely spicy grilled fish. The other customers weren't paying any attention to her, and she heaved a sigh of relief. She turned her attention back to the grilled fish in front of her with glowing eyes. The spicy sauce gave her a spicy sensation that wasn't present in normal spicy dishes. Furthermore, unlike the pure spiciness that she usually ate, this spiciness was fragrant and spicy, making it irresistible to her. Within the sauce was a crispy fish skin, and it was extremely crispy. She gently bit into the fish skin, and the fish meat was extraordinarily tender. After absorbing the spicy flavor, the freshness of the fish meat hadn't been ruined in the slightest. The delectable flavor spread through her mouth, and all of her taste buds seemed to have been instantly stimulated. This was something that they had never tasted before, and it was the most delicious fish that Vivian had ever eaten in over a decade. Furthermore, this fish really didn't have any bones, and there weren't any shark fins in the smooth and tender flesh. The delectable flavor reminded Vivian of the large sea fish that her father's friend had brought to her from the seaside not long ago. That fish was also very delicious and didn't have any bones, but it had been stewed into a soup by the cook, and it was completely incomparable to this spicy grilled fish. Was 1,600 copper coins a piece expensive? Even though Vivian felt that this dish was a little indecent, she still didn't think that it was expensive at all. Such a delectable dish couldn't be measured in monetary terms. Just as Meg had said, this dish was far more delicious than its price. He had the confidence to say those words, and then he did it. Just this dish alone was enough to convince Vivian of what Robert had said to his father in the afternoon. This restaurant could definitely become a name card in the Aiden Square, or even in Chaos City, AACom. Vivian held her chopsticks and was about to pick up the second piece of fish. Hey, Big Brother Mustache, your breasts seem to have grown bigger. A soft voice sounded. Vivian's hand and face immediately stiffened. She didn't know when Amy had brought the little orange cat to the table and was looking at her chest with an adorable expression. She wanted to find a hole to crawl into and hide. Why did this little girl have to bring up such a sore spot? Furthermore, how could she say that out loud? Ara. Vivian could sense all of the gazes directed at her, and she hurriedly pulled her clothes up to cover her chest. She smiled and said, "You must be mistaken, little friend. If you say something like that, you'll be taken away by demons. Don't worry, Father will protect me." Amy shook her head with a fearless expression. She stared intently at Vivian's chest for a while, then turned to the nervous Vivian, and shrugged as she said, "All right, if you say so, then so be it." She then carried Ugly Duckling back to the table and continued to teach it a lesson. "I didn't have any in the first place," Vivian emphasized in a serious manner. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry at Amy's adult-like behavior. As expected, children were quite difficult to deal with, especially children who weren't even afraid of demons. Thankfully, this little guy didn't cause any trouble. Otherwise, it would have been quite awkward. Vivian glared at Sconard with a hint of warning in her eyes. She could already tell from the way Sconard had raised his head that he had most likely already recognized her. He was just pretending not to know her. Sconard hurriedly lowered his head and continued to eat his grilled fish. He had initially wanted to leave a good impression on Vivian during the meal, and perhaps even develop their relationship. However, everything had gone wrong ever since he had entered the restaurant. With that in mind, tears began to flow from his eyes. It wasn't that he was too sad, It was just that he simply couldn't control himself from the spiciness of the grilled fish. Seeing as no one was paying attention to her, Vivian quickly immersed herself in the delectable grilled fish. The fragrant and spicy flavor instantly whetted her appetite, and the boneless fish also eliminated all of her fears and worries about the tiny bones in the fish. She simply couldn't stop eating one bite after another. Fine beads of sweat began to appear on her forehead. After swallowing the grilled fish, a scorching sensation flowed down her throat before spreading throughout her entire body. It was a comfortable sensation that was similar to soaking in a hot spring. However, compared to the delicious taste of the grilled fish, Vivian had already completely ignored all of the other reactions that her body was experiencing. She was completely focused on enjoying the grilled fish in front of her. Under normal circumstances, she would only be able to finish half of the grilled fish at most, but she felt like she could finish the whole thing today. Looks like the spicy grilled fish is going to be able to make a name for itself in this world. It's just that the Aden Square Food competition rankings are still a problem. The Catering Association has been around for so long, and it's going to be very difficult to resolve in a short period of time. Looks like I'll have to pay a visit to the City Lord's castle tomorrow, or get the customers to sign a petition or something. Meg's brows furrowed as he thought to himself. Chapter 355. No, we're just here to eat. Warren shook his head with a smile as he said, Robert must have already reported this to the City Lord. The City Lord is very busy, so he can't possibly pay too much attention to a small restaurant. However, Robert has been working in the City Lord's castle for many years, so we're just here to learn more about this restaurant in case the City Lord asks about it. But if the City Lord doesn't know about the restaurant, then can't we just say whatever we want? Tony's was still rather perplexed. The City Lord is the supreme ruler of Chaos City, and one of the smartest people on the entire Norland continent. Do you think you can fool him with just a few words? Warren shook his head with a smile, and sighed with emotion as he said, Every time I see the City Lord, I'm always in awe. How can a powerful 10th tier knight have such a meticulous mind and awe-inspiring wisdom? Then what are we doing here today? Tony's asked with a hint of awe and veneration on his face. Compared to us, he'll definitely trust Robert's words more. Hence, what we have to do is to learn more about this restaurant than Robert, and then find its Achilles heel. Clashing with the owner of a restaurant is the lowest form of behavior. As the vice president of the Restaurant Association, you should know what you should and shouldn't do. The smile on Warren's face faded as he took a glance at Tony's before opening the restaurant's door and making his way in. Tony's expression changed slightly, and he lowered his head before following Warren into the restaurant. Burp, after finishing the entire spicy grilled fish, there wasn't even a single strand of vermicelli left on the grill, and Vivian burped with satisfaction. Only then did she notice that she was drenched in sweat. Even her hair was wet, and her body was warm as if she had just taken a comfortable bath. The spiciness in her mouth was already slowly receding, and a joyful smile appeared on Vivian's face. Even though she was a little full, she still felt extremely blissful. Here's the bill, Vivian said as she raised a hand. Big brother mustache, that'll be 1,600 copper coins. Amy made her way over to Vivian with her little hand extended toward her. Little. Vivian raised her eyebrows. Although she was indeed wearing a mustache now, she still felt a little strange that the little girl had given her such a nickname. After all, she was also a beautiful little celestial maiden. However, when he saw Amy's adorable expression, the little bit of resentment in his heart quickly dissipated. Sure enough, being adorable allowed one to do whatever one wanted. He took out his wallet from his waist and prepared to pay the bill. I'm here to seek enlightenment. Sconard, who was drenched in sweat, stood up as he stuttered, and pulled out his money pouch to settle the bill. I don't need anyone to pay for me. 16 gold coins. Goodbye, little guy. Vivian grabbed a handful of gold coins and placed them in Amy's little hands. She then got up and walked out of the restaurant. Goodbye, mustache brother. Amy nodded before turning to Sconard, and asking, Smoking Red Lion, are you going to pay the bill as well? The total is 2,000 copper coins. A red lion that can emit smoke? Sconard's eyes widened. Since when had he been given such a weird nickname? However, he looked at Vivian's departing figure, then at the half-eaten grilled fish in front of him. His numb tongue and scorching throat were both yearning for more grilled fish, and he hesitated momentarily before sitting down and continuing to eat. In that instant, neither Vivian nor the young mistress of the City Lord's castle could stop him from continuing to eat the grilled fish. His body's instinctive desire had already overtaken his rationality. There was no way he could resist the combination of delicious and spicy food. Vivian was just about to leave the restaurant with a ticket when she bumped into Warren and Tony's, who had just opened the door. A hint of surprise flashed through her eyes, and she lowered her head as she walked past them. Only after exiting the restaurant did she turn around and murmur to herself, "Isn't that Fatso the president of the Catering Association? Didn't he just remove this restaurant from the rankings today? Why is he here as well? This restaurant deserves a 5-star rating regardless of whether it's the environment, service, or taste. It's always filled to the brim with customers. A dish as delicious as the spicy grilled fish should be at the top of the Aiden Square Food Rankings board. I have to go back and talk to father about this. If the owner doesn't want to open his restaurant anymore, where else am I going to find such delicious grilled fish in the future? I'm only doing this because of the delicious food. It has nothing to do with the owner and his friends," Vivian said in a serious voice. A gust of autumn wind blew past, and her clothes were drenched in sweat, causing her to shiver. She quickly hailed a horse-drawn carriage, and went straight back to the City Lord's castle. The decor is quite elegant, and the layout isn't too cramped. However, there's no racial segregation, and there's no restriction on the identity or race of the customers, so some customers might feel uncomfortable. There really are a lot of customers, and the restaurant is already full. There's still a steady stream of customers lining up. There are a lot of customers, but it's not very noisy, and the environment is a 5-star rating. Warren walked into the restaurant, and began to appraise the restaurant as he appraised it in his heart. Yarbemia made her way over to Warren with a smile, and said, "Hello, there are a lot of customers in the restaurant right now, so you might have to wait a while for your meal." "Well, okay." Warren nodded before turning to Yarbemia with a hint of surprise in his eyes. Ever since a restaurant had been smashed by a half-human waitress last year, there had been virtually no half-human waitresses in the Aiden Square. He didn't think that this restaurant would hire a half-dragon waitress. However, this half-dragon waitress was very friendly, and her smile was very contagious. Even though she was a half-dragon, Warren was still willing to give her a 5-star rating. Why is she a half-dragon? Tony's brows furrowed as he stood behind Warren. His voice wasn't very loud, but Yarbemia still heard him, and his expression changed slightly as he reflexively clenched his fists. Is there a law in Chaos City that forbids half-dragon waitresses from working as waitresses? Right at this moment, Sally made her way over to Yarbemia with a serious expression as she looked into Tony's eyes. All of the businesses in the Aiden Square agree that half-dragon waitresses aren't needed. That's more effective than the law. Tony's was quite stunned by Sally's beauty, but he was used to being fawned over by all of the other restaurant owners, so he was naturally quite displeased to be contradicted by a waitress. Many of the customers turned toward them, and they were all rather surprised to see Warren and Tony's. The monthly Aiden Square food competition rankings were announced by Warren himself, so everyone was quite familiar with this chubby president. However, they had just removed Mammy Restaurant from the rankings today, so could it be that they were here to pick a fight with them? He was picking on the waitress as soon as he entered the restaurant. Chapter 356. Meg was standing in front of Sally and Yarbemia with a plate of fried rice in his hand, facing Warren, and the atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to have become a little tense. Mammis had been removed from the Aiden Square food competition rankings this morning, and everyone was furious. However, Mr. Mac was most likely the most enraged one. He had been smiling the entire day, and hadn't brought any negative emotions to his customers, but judging from his attitude toward the president of the Catering Association, it was clear that he was very angry. However, Mr. Mac was indeed Mr. Mac, and he was different from other restaurant owners. Normally, if a restaurant wanted to get back onto the rankings, they would have been forced to serve the president of the Catering Association in person. What was wrong with the waiters being treated like this? However, Meg wasn't doing that. He was going to protect his customers to the very end, and he wasn't going to back down in the slightest. Is Mr. Mac going to lay all his cards on the table? All of the customers were filled with curiosity and anticipation. If Mr. Mac was going to stand up for his restaurant, then they were all ready to back him up. They simply couldn't stand for their restaurant being removed from the rankings. That's right. Chaos City's laws are the best laws on the entire Norland continent. Warren looked at the smiling Mag, and his eyes narrowed even further. A fake smile appeared on his face as he said, however, some things are still worth respecting. Regardless of whether you're the first to arrive or the last to arrive, there has to be a rule. That's true. Nothing can be accomplished without rules, but those rules have to be clean and transparent in order to be worthy of respect and acknowledgement. Mag's smile also faded as he looked at Warren, and a serious expression appeared on his face as he said, President Warren, have you heard about Mammy Restaurant being removed from the Aiden Square Food Competition Rankings Board today? If the Aiden Square Food Competition Rankings are designed to make it easier for customers to find their own food, then why was our restaurant removed from the rankings for no reason? If possible, I hope you can give me a reasonable explanation for this. Your tickets are so expensive. I bought tens of thousands of them, but in the end, you disqualified me. That's not very kind. Meg had seen Warren's portrait before. Although the hand-drawn portrait was slightly different from the real person, the black mole between his eyebrows was still very recognizable. The person standing behind him was clearly the same person as him. Judging from his bulging belly, he was most likely also a leader of the catering association. Meg was a little surprised. These two people had just removed his restaurant from the ranking list in the morning, and now they were here for dinner in the evening. Most likely, they didn't have good intentions. However, he was just worried that he had no place to reason with. Since these two had delivered themselves to his doorstep, he might as well say it out loud so that all the guests present could listen. After all, this was his home field. All of the guests were quite intrigued by Meg's words. Mr. Mac's straightforward manner of speaking indicated that he wasn't afraid of offending anyone at all. However, his words also triggered the curiosity and anger in everyone's hearts. They all wanted an explanation from the catering association. What are you saying, boss? Why is your restaurant the only one that has been removed from the rankings list? Don't you have any idea what's going on? Tony's was a little enraged at the sight of the aggressive Meg. He was the one who had instigated all of this, but Meg had never taken him seriously. In fact, he hadn't even taken a single glance at him. Now, he was even questioning the fairness of the catering association, and that made Tony's extremely angry. As such, he naturally had to show off in front of Warren. If it's because two of my restaurant's 5 dishes are in the top 30, 4 in the top 50, and all 5 in the top 100, and we're the only restaurant on the list that occupies too many places, I have nothing to say about it. I still have the guts to do so. Meg looked at Tony's with a mocking smile as he said, You look like an employee of the catering association, right? Even though you're not wearing a uniform, your figure is quite fitting, so it's quite easy to identify you. Ha ha ha. I suddenly understand why little boss speaks like that. It's all in his genes. That's why it's best not to mess with Mr. Mac. When he speaks, he's an upgraded version of Little Boss. All of the guests looked at Tony's and Warren upon hearing Meg's words, and they couldn't help but burst into laughter. They didn't think that the normally gentle and amiable Mr. Mac would have such a sharp tongue. Normal people wouldn't be able to handle it. You. Tony's was so enraged that all of the fat on his body was trembling. He was used to being praised, so he didn't know how to respond to this sudden attack. As the supervisor and guide of Chaos City's Catering Association, the employees of the Catering Association have to come into contact with delicious food. Only after tasting the food can we serve it to our customers with confidence. This is the conscience of the Aiden Square Food Competition. After eating so many different types of delicious food, one's figure naturally becomes like this. I've never thought of this as shameful fat. Instead, it's a reflection of the responsibility that all of the employees of the Catering Association have toward their customers. This is the conscience of the Catering Association. Warren looked at Meg with a serious expression, and spoke with a hint of inviolability in his voice. Meg looked at Warren, and his eyes gradually lit up. Compared to Tony's, whose verbal skills were virtually non-existent, this president who had reformed the Catering Association and raised it up to where it was today really was a shrewd individual. He was able to turn all of his fat into a conscience. Not only did he have no choice, but he also displayed a sense of responsibility. He had instantly turned the tables on the Catering Association, and was a rare opponent for Meg. Meg smiled, and said, "If you have too much fat, it can easily lead to heart disease or myocardial infarction. If that's the case, your conscience will be quite painful, just like what I'm feeling right now. Not missing out on any of the dishes is the Catering Association's promise to our customers. For that, all of the employees of the Catering Association, including myself, are willing to do everything in our power, including sacrificing our health and lives." A smile also appeared on Warren's face as he looked at Meg, and said, "I was the one who made the decision to remove your restaurant from the rankings. We received many complaints from customers and restaurants, so we had to remove your restaurant from the rankings first. Vice President Tony's and I came here tonight with the intention of not missing out on any of the restaurants with potential. However, it seems that the boss doesn't seem to be very welcoming of us." As if I'd believe that. Meg chuckled coldly in his heart. There was a reason why this guy had been able to control the Aiden Square food competition for so long. His words had completely dispelled all of the doubts and mockery that he had harbored, and it was difficult for him to refute them. However, seeing as they had come here specifically to eat, things would be much easier. If they said that the food wasn't good, then they wouldn't be able to stop eating, and that would be a huge slap to the face. Chapter 357. Where's young mistress? In a pink room in the City Lord's castle, Michael took a glance at the long pillow wrapped under the blanket before turning to the two female servants with their heads lowered with a slightly angry expression. Young mistress. Young mistress said she wasn't feeling well in the evening, and wanted to sleep, so we helped her sleep, and then this happened. We don't know where young mistress went, either, the woman on the left said in a slightly frightened voice. The maid on the left said softly. Her expression was a little scared. Although the young miss ran out like this every time, and in the end, the master would not blame them for the matter, but standing in front of the angry city lord, not many people could remain calm. Perhaps young mistress went out to eat again. She should be back soon, the woman on the right chimed in. She was closer to Miss, so she knew that Miss was going to sneak out to eat today. However, she didn't expect that master, who had said that he wouldn't go home for dinner tonight, suddenly came back early and asked her to have dinner with Madam. That was why the current situation happened. You two can go now. I'll wait for her here. The anger on Michael's face receded, and he waved a hand at the two of them with a resigned look in his eyes. He was well aware of his daughter's temper. She didn't even listen to him, so what could two little maids do to her? Yes. The two maids hurriedly left the room, and carefully closed the door behind them. This child must be craving food again. She's taken too many medicines because of this illness, and there are too many things that she can't eat. Where can I find the medicine that can cure this illness? Michael sighed in the dimming room, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes became even more pronounced. This powerful city lord of Chaos City in the eyes of others seemed to be a little tired and old. Boss is so nice. Yarbemia looked at Meg's back with a warm feeling in her heart. It seemed that as long as she stood behind Meg, all of the doubts about her identity wouldn't hurt her. It was like a large umbrella that shielded her from the storm. Sally glanced at Yarbemia before heading to the kitchen with the plate in her hand. This was probably why she felt like she was gradually getting used to this place. She didn't have to worry about being stabbed in the back. She just had to do her own thing. You're just going to leave us hanging? Tony's watched as Meg entered the kitchen. He thought that Meg would at least arrange for them to sit down first, but it seemed like he had no such intention. Instead, he asked them to line up like ordinary customers. Just relax and be a guest. Who knows, we might really be able to eat something different today. Warren, on the other hand, appeared rather calm as he swept his gaze across the faces of the customers. Their expressions when they were enjoying the food would never lie. Back then, when he followed Laurie from restaurant to restaurant, Laurie would teach him how to observe the expressions on the customers' faces when they were enjoying the food. This was an important reference for the gourmet rankings. The food that could bring enjoyment to the customers was the real delicacy. However, the expressions on the faces of the customers in the restaurant were rather surprising to him. He had never seen any restaurant where all the customers were immersed in the food before them with expressions of uncontrollable joy and enjoyment. Everyone was enjoying the food that they had been looking forward to, and their expressions revealed everything. This was an almost impossible scene, yet it had taken place in this restaurant. Soon, Sconard, who was munching away at a grilled fish, attracted Warren's attention. The fish was a little ridiculously large, and it was quite apparent from the size of the fish that it had been in the past. However, this ordinary-looking young man was almost finishing the entire fish. What was even more peculiar was that as the young man ate, white smoke was rising from his head. His clothes looked as if they had been soaked in water, and his lips were swollen to the point of turning purple. However, the chopsticks in his hand didn't seem to be able to stop. He was panting heavily as he ate, completely immersed in his own world of grilled fish. What kind of fish is that young man eating? Warren turned to Yarbemia with a curious look on his face. This was a cooking method that he had never seen before, and it was also the first time that he had seen a dish being cooked in such a manner. Furthermore, this dish wasn't one of the 5 dishes on Amy's rankings board, so it was most likely a new dish that had just been released recently. That's a spicy grilled fish, an insanely spicy one, Yarbemia explained. She had already learned that these two were the president and vice president of the Catering Association, so she was very angry that her restaurant had been removed from the rankings board. Heh, insanely spicy? How spicy can it be? I don't think so. Tunney's pursed his lips with disdain. I don't know exactly how spicy it is, either. You'll know once you try it, Yarbemia replied with a smile. Tunney's felt as if he had been looked down upon by Yarbemia, and he immediately agreed, all right, then I'll have an insanely spicy one. There are 3 sizes of spicy grilled fish, small, medium, and large. Which size would you like? Yarbemia asked. Tunney's hesitated momentarily before replying, I'll have a medium one. All right, we'll start serving the dish after you've taken your seat. Yarbemia nodded in response. If it were any other customer, she would perhaps remind them that the insanely spicy dish wasn't as spicy as the average spiciness, but she didn't want to remind this annoying guy. Since when did you like spicy food, Tunney's? Warren asked with a smile. I actually don't like spicy food, either, but I feel like this restaurant is just trying to pull off a publicity stunt. What insanely spicy? I think it's all a hoax, Tunney's replied with a smile. That's not necessarily true. Warren shook his head as he looked at Sconard. However, seeing as this young man wasn't willing to put down his chopsticks even though it was so spicy, it had to be an extremely delicious dish. After waiting for a long while, Warren and Tunney's finally found a seat. They sat down across from a tall and broad Minotaur demon, and Tunney's wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He was feeling extremely pressured even without doing anything. Thankfully, the demon beside him was immersed in a bowl of tofu pudding, and had no intention of paying any attention to him. Tunney's, what else would you like to have aside from grilled fish? Warren flipped open the menu. He was already aware of the price of the dishes, so he wasn't too surprised by the price. Chapter 358. Where's young mistress? In the city lord's castle, in a room that was mainly decorated in pink, Michael glanced at the long pillow under the blanket, and then at the 2 young maids with their heads hung low with a slightly angry expression. Young mistress. Young mistress said that she wasn't feeling well in the evening and wanted to sleep, so we helped her to sleep, and then this is what you see now, master. We don't know where young mistress went, the maid on the left said softly with a slightly fearful expression. The maid on the left said softly, looking a little scared. Although the young miss always ran out like this, and the old master would not blame them for everything in the end, standing in front of the angry city lord, there were not many people who could remain calm. Perhaps young mistress went out to eat like before, and she should be back soon. The young maid on the side added. She had a closer relationship with young mistress, so she knew that young mistress was going to sneak out to eat today. However, she didn't expect that the master, who had said that he wouldn't be home for dinner tonight, would suddenly come back early, and even asked her to eat with Madam, which led to the current situation. "You can leave first, I'll wait here for her to come back." The anger on Michael's face faded, and he waved his hand at the two of them. There was a hint of helplessness in his eyes. It wasn't like he didn't know his daughter's temper. She didn't even listen to him, so what could the two young maids do to her? Yes. The two young maids hurriedly turned and left the room, carefully closing the door behind them. This child must be craving for food again. She's taken too much medicine during these past few years, and there are too many things that she can't eat. Where can I find medicine that can cure her? Michael sighed in the darkening room, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes were particularly pronounced. This city lord of Chaos City, who was extremely powerful in the eyes of others, appeared to be a little weary and frail. "Boss is so nice." Yarbemia looked at Mag's departing figure, and a warm feeling welled up in her heart. It was as if as long as she stood behind Mag, all questions about her identity would no longer be able to harm her. It was as if she were standing behind Mag, shielding her from the elements. Sally took a glance at Yarbemia before making her way toward the kitchen with her plate in her hand. This was most likely why she was gradually getting used to this place. She didn't have to worry about scheming against others, and she didn't have to worry about being stabbed in the back. All she had to do was take care of her own business. "He's just going to leave us hanging." Tony's looked on as Mag walked into the kitchen. He had thought that Mag would at least arrange for them to take a seat first, but it appeared that he wasn't planning to do that. Instead, he was making them line up like normal customers. "Don't worry about being customers. Perhaps we'll really be able to eat something different today." In contrast, Warren appeared to be quite calm and collected. He looked at all of the customers around him, and the expressions on their faces when they were enjoying delicious food couldn't lie. Back when he had been to all of the restaurants with Laurie had taught him how to observe the expressions on customers' faces when they were enjoying their food. This was an important reference for the Aiden Square Food Competition Rankings Board. Only food that could bring enjoyment to customers was truly delicious. However, the expressions on the faces of the customers in the restaurant had come as quite a surprise to him. He had never seen a restaurant where all of the customers were completely immersed in the delicious food in front of them. Everyone was enjoying the food that they were looking forward to, and their expressions had already revealed everything. This was something that was almost impossible to happen in this restaurant. Soon, Sconard caught Warren's attention. The size of the fish was a little exaggerated. From the size of the fish's skeleton alone, one could infer just how large it must have been before it was even touched. However, this ordinary-looking young man had almost finished the entire fish. What was even more peculiar was that white smoke was rising from the young man's head as he ate. His clothes appeared to have been completely soaked, and his lips were swollen to the point of purple. However, he simply couldn't stop eating with his chopsticks. He panted heavily as he ate, completely immersed in his own world of grilled fish. "What kind of fish is that young man eating?" Warren turned to Yarbemia with a curious expression. He had never seen such a method of cooking before, and it was also the first time that he had seen such a method of eating. Furthermore, this dish wasn't one of Mammy Restaurant's top 5 dishes, so it was most likely a new dish that had only been released recently. "That's a spicy grilled fish, insanely spicy." She had already learned that these two were the president and vice president of the Catering Association, and she was very angry that their restaurant had been removed from the rankings. "Heh, insanely spicy? How spicy can it be? I don't think it's that spicy." Tony's pursed his lips with a disdainful expression. "I don't know exactly how spicy it is, either. You'll know once you taste it," Yarbemia replied with a smile. Tony's felt like he had been looked down upon by Yarbemia, and his blood rushed to his head as he said, "All right, then I'll have an insanely spicy one." There are 3 sizes of spicy grilled fish: small, medium, and large. "May I ask what size would you like?" Yarbemia asked. "I'll have a medium-size one," Tony's replied after a brief hesitation. "All right, the dishes will be served after you've taken your seat." Yarbemia nodded in response. If it were any other customer, She would perhaps remind them that the insanely spicy level was not a normal level of spicy, but she didn't want to remind this annoying guy. "Tony's, when did you start to like spicy food?" Warren asked with a smile. "I'm actually not a big fan of spicy food, but I feel like this restaurant is just trying to create some hype." "Insanely spicy? I think it's all a scam." Tony's chuckled, but he wasn't too concerned. "Not necessarily." Warren shook his head as he looked at Sconard. However, the fact that this young man refused to put down his chopsticks even though it was so spicy indicated that it had to be a very delicious dish. After waiting for a long while, Warren and Tony's finally found their seats. They sat down next to a tall and burly Minotaur demon, and Tony's wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He was feeling a lot of pressure just by doing nothing. Thankfully, the demon beside him was immersed in a bowl of white tofu pudding, and had no intention of paying him any heed. "Tony's, what would you like to eat aside from grilled fish?" Warren flipped open the menu, and due to the fact that he was already aware of the prices of the dishes, he wasn't all that surprised by the prices. Chapter 359. Is it really that good? Tony's couldn't help but pick up a spoonful of savory tofu pudding upon hearing Warren's praise, upon which his eyes immediately lit up. The tofu pudding slid down his tongue, and the faint flavor of the tofu pudding and the savory sauce instantly fused together in his mouth. The few simple side dishes served as the finishing touch, and they complemented the sweet tofu pudding to create an extremely refreshing and delicious flavor. After swallowing, the faint flavor of the bean lingered in his mouth for a long time, and it wasn't greasy at all. "What is this thing made of? How can it be so delicious? Normal soybeans definitely can't make such a delicious dish. It's simply too delicious." Tony stared at the tofu pudding in front of him with wide eyes. It was unbelievably delicious, and it had completely overturned his expectations of what good food should be like. Tony's couldn't help but pick up his spoon again and put another spoonful of tofu pudding into his mouth. The delicious tofu pudding spread throughout his mouth, and he simply couldn't stop. All of those thoughts of finding fault, and slandering others, had been tossed to the back of his mind as he was completely entranced by the delicious tofu pudding. It had been a long time since he had enjoyed such delicious food, and it was a very special feeling to be able to cast aside all of his desires and focus solely on enjoying delicious food. Amy held Ugly Duckling in her arms as she looked on at the two men devouring the tofu pudding, and murmured, "Those two fat grandpas say they don't want it, but their bodies are very honest." Knowing smiles appeared on the faces of all of the customers upon hearing that. They had thought that the two of them would try to find fault with the tofu pudding, but who would have thought that they would fall for the tofu pudding so quickly? Let's give them a taste of what it's like to only have one serving. The only thing that makes me want to give Mr. Mac's restaurant a bad review is that the tofu pudding is limited to one serving per person, Harrison murmured to himself as he panted heavily. Harrison mumbled as he panted heavily. He had already finished half of the medium grilled fish in front of him, and was looking at Warren and Tony's with great interest. Warren put down his spoon, and said to Yarbemia, "Phew, this is so delicious. I'll have another sweet tofu pudding. I want another savory tofu pudding, no, two." Tony's also put down his spoon, and chimed in. "Tony's, I think you should try the sweet tofu pudding. Sweet tofu pudding has a faint tofu pudding aroma, so it's truly delicious when you add some syrup to it. The salty flavor completely ruins the sweet flavor," Warren suggested with a serious expression. "President, I think you should try the savory tofu pudding before you say that. This savory tofu pudding has pickled mustard greens and small shrimps added to it, and it has a refreshing texture that perfectly complements the fragrance of the tofu pudding. The tofu pudding already has a sweet flavor to it, and it's hard to imagine just how sweet the syrup would be." Tony's shook his head as he looked at Warren to express his objection. "I'm sorry, but there's only one serving of tofu pudding per person," Yarbemia said softly as she looked at the two people arguing. "What?" Both of them looked at Yarbemia at the same time and raised their voices. "Why is it limited? It's not like we're not paying, so I won't ask for 2 servings. Just give me another savory tofu pudding." Tony's brows furrowed as he looked at Yarbemia. If it weren't for the fact that he had ordered a lot of other dishes, He felt like he would be able to eat 10 bowls of this delicious tofu pudding. Seeing as the customers want it, and the restaurant also has tofu pudding, why aren't you selling it to us? Warren was also a little perplexed, and he was also unwilling to only eat one bowl. This is the restaurant's rule, and it's clearly stated on the menu. Please understand and abide by it. Yabemia straightened her back with a serious expression. Her initial uneasiness had been slowly replaced by confidence. This was a rule set by Meg, so there had to be a reason for it. Warren took a look at the menu, and it was indeed stated that there was only one serving per person. A thought suddenly occurred to Warren: if Meg combined these two dishes together, would it still be able to make it into the top 30 on the competition list? Warren raised a hand to stop Tony's from speaking, and he turned to Yabemia with a smile as he said, "All right, please bring out the rest of our dishes." "All right, please wait a moment." Yabemia nodded before turning and making her way toward the kitchen. "President, we should have held on a little longer," Tony said with an indignant expression. "Are you going to insist on letting others see you unable to extricate yourself from the tofu pudding and even throw a tantrum?" Warren took a meaningful glance at Tony's. Tony's expression changed slightly upon hearing this, and he suddenly recalled what they were here for. The delicious tofu pudding had completely enthralled him, and he was unable to extricate himself from it. Logic told him that there was no way that this restaurant would be able to make it onto the competition list again, but he still couldn't help but compare the tofu pudding to the other dishes on the competition list. Even if the tofu pudding didn't make it onto the top spot, it would at least make it into the top 5. Warren was also silently waiting for the dishes to be served. His face was completely expressionless, and no one knew what he was thinking. Mr. Mack's rules really are rules. Even the president of the Catering Association has no room for negotiation. I hope they'll be able to get Amy's back onto the competition list tomorrow. Otherwise, they'll definitely have a black conscience. That's hard to say. After all, they didn't even come to inspect the restaurant today before removing it from the competition list. All of the customers looked on with smiles on their faces. It was very satisfying to see the president of the Catering Association being forced to submit to the restaurant's rules. Soon, the Yangju fried rice, rujiamo, and braised chicken and rice were served. Soon, the two of them were immersed in the new delicacies and couldn't pull themselves away. One mouthful of rujiamo, one mouthful of Yangju fried rice, and they ate very happily. Their faces were full of joy. Burp. Warren burped with a satisfied expression as he put down the earthenware bowl that he had licked clean. He looked down at the bottom of the bowl, and a slightly awkward expression appeared on his face as he pushed the bowl closer to the center of the table. It had been many years since he had last tasted something like this. He had thought that there was no delicacy in this world that he hadn't tasted since he frequented all of the high-end restaurants in the Aden Square. However, one dish after another had been served, and he had tasted completely different delicacies. Each and every dish was a new experience, and he couldn't help but look forward to the next dish. He had never tasted rice that was fried with all types of ingredients, nor had he ever tasted rujiamo that was sandwiched between two sweet and crispy pancakes, nor had he ever tasted braised chicken that was cooked with shiitake mushrooms. However, all of these dishes had been cooked by the same chef, and they were all so delicious. This restaurant owner was a complete genius. If this were 20 years ago, I would have probably ranked all of the dishes in this restaurant from the number 1 spot to the number 5 spot. Warren looked at Meg's receding figure in the kitchen. He was a genius who could topple the entire food industry in the Aden Square. It was a pity that he was born at the wrong time. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.